Good morning to those of you west of the UK, and afternoon, good evening to those of you east of the UK, where I'm based. Welcome to this second day of our virtual conference on reimagining belonging in Latin America and beyond, with a focus on access to citizenship, digital identity, and rights. My name is Amal de Chiquera, and I am one of the co-directors of the Institute on Statelessness and Inclusion. And we at ISI are delighted to be co-sponsoring this conference along with the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies and the School of Advanced Study of the University of London. And of course, a massive thanks to Eve for all the fantastic work she's done behind the scenes to bring this conference to fruition and to bring us all together in this virtual space. And of course, to everyone who's been supporting Eve behind the scenes as well. I think it's a great accomplishment to facilitate a very timely discussion on issues around legal identity, nationality, documentation, etc. And speaking of timely conversations, the first panel, which I have the privilege to be serving as moderator for, is looking at digital identity, rights, and COVID-19. The title of our panel is The Dawn of a New Era, Digital ID, Rights, and COVID-19. And this is indeed such a topical issue to be focusing on. Of course, no one needs to say anything about the way COVID-19 has completely disrupted our lives. The fact that we're meeting virtually for this conference is just one of many examples of how the world has changed and adapted as a result of COVID-19. And of course, digital ID was and has been one of these topics which has become a bit of a fad. And it's something which is promoted often uncritically by governments, by UN agencies, by commercial private companies as well. And it's an issue which it's an area which is quite complex, and it has there's lots of promise that it holds within it, but also lots of questions, lots of concerns in terms of what this drive for digital ID can mean and does mean, particularly in terms of groups who are at the periphery of societies, who have been othered, whose belonging is questioned, undocumented people whose legal status is disadvantageous to them, people who are stateless, etc. So this is an issue which certainly for us at ISI is an issue that we've been looking at and working on very closely. Some of you may be aware that just last week, a global consortium of actors working on COVID-19 and statelessness, which ISI is a part of, and indeed one of our panelists, Bridget Pudding, is also a part of this consortium, published this report which looked at the COVID-19 impact on stateless people. And the report, it focuses on a whole range of rights issues, and the issue of documentation, legal identity, and legal status features very prominently in this report. Similarly, in November last year, we published a report which looked at digital identity in the context of the Rohingya community. And again, we see digital ID in that report as well as a double-edged sword in terms of both the promise it holds, but also the real risk that the rollout of digital ID systems, particularly when layered on top of discriminatory laws and policies and practices, can lead to just further entrench disadvantage, entrench exclusion, and entrench the denial of rights, as opposed to serving to enhance the quality of life of people. So I will, for those of you who are interested, I will share both of the links to both of these reports in the chat box in a moment. But let me now turn my attention to our wonderful panel that we have. We are going to have presentations from around the world, focusing on the situation in the Dominican Republic, but also looking at Australia, Brazil, and China, and just giving us a really broad range of countries and geographies and and challenges and issues that come up in this context. The 3 papers that will be presented today will be presented, like each panelist will take around 15 minutes to present their papers, and then we will reserve the final 30 minutes or so of this session for your questions and comments. And whilst the panel presentation will be recorded, the Q&A session will not be recorded. So please feel free to raise your hand during the Q&A session and share your questions or your comments with the panelists, or if you would prefer to type up your questions using the chat function, in which case I will then take them up and present them to the panelists. So without further ado, let me welcome our first panelist, Bridget Wooding, a wonderful colleague who I've known for many years now, who is with OBMICA, the Migration Observatory in the Caribbean. And she's going to be presenting her paper entitled The Entanglement of Biometrics with the COVID-19 Response in the Dominican Republic. Who does not get in? Bridget, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much indeed, Amal, and good morning from here in Santo Domingo, the Dominican Republic, to everybody. A special thank you to the organizers, Eve and Amal. Eve, who's done so much to get this wonderful conference together, and for a very stimulating first day yesterday. And also a special shout out to 2 close colleagues who are here with us today, Alison Petrociello and Camila Moren, who have also done much work on this topic. Alison will be presenting later on, so I have a good backup when we get to Q&A. Now, it's a commonplace that the pandemic has exacerbated pre-existing inequalities, especially for groups of non-recognized citizens, as Matt Gibney calls stateless persons, or migrants with irregular migration status. The last UNDP Global Human Development Report underlines that the Dominican Republic has descended 21 points on its human development ranking because of increased inequalities. Levels of social inequality in the country increase the vulnerability of certain groups of persons, not only because of uneven income, but also due to differentiated access to basic services, health, and social protection. Immigrants and their descendants lose out, especially those who have an irregular migration status or lack documentation to accredit their nationality. This paper looks at those excluded from official aid under the pandemic who do not figure on the Dominican Social Register, while filling in the gaps left by state relief efforts has occurred somewhat piecemeal by international humanitarian organizations in association with local NGO. Less attention has been given to redressing the differential documentation status, which leads to these exclusions failing to reach unworthy to statized populations. However, the situation is not monolithic, and discrepancies occur between central and local government, where community responses contest an authoritarian anti-migrant discourse. In consequence, I focus on creative strategies following on from a research project carried out in October last year, intended to gain inclusion and examine how these have developed in pandemic times, not least in response to the national vaccine campaign underway. So after presenting a summary context to the current situation, I focus on key findings from 2 areas of our research. Finally, I note how these have been capitalized on in civil society advocacy towards equitable access in a current national vaccine campaign. So a little context. Following a decade of restrictive measures on migration and nationality matters, in late 2013, the Constitutional Tribunal in Santo Domingo issued a ruling which effectively denationalized over 130,000 Dominicans of mainly Haitian ancestry. Despite some limited pushback achieved by civil society actors and their allies at home and abroad, and notwithstanding official rhetoric to the contrary, this egregious violation of human rights is far from being redressed. Compared with international norms for addressing statelessness, the legal framework developed in country since 2014 is inadequate, but nevertheless gives human rights defenders some space with which to maneuver to restore the rights of nationality stripped persons. As our keynote speaker remarked yesterday, quote, "No state wants to be a pariah." And so it proves in the Dominican Republic, where the legislative fix of 2014 is the only tangible tool which civil society has at hand to continue to press for policy dialogue towards more sustainable solutions for those denationalized Dominicans of Haitian ancestry. Now to the research. So our OBMICA research carried out with associate researcher of OBMICA, Alison Petrociello, who is here today and will do a piece in a panel later today. We sought to investigate the extra layer of difficulty posed by COVID-19 on populations already in a situation of vulnerability in one of the poorest areas of the Dominican Republic. The inclusion of Haitian-born migrants in the study was a strategic decision given the relationship between historical and contemporary migration and the risk of statelessness and resulting social exclusion of their descendants born in country. And a shout out here to the Institute, AMAL, which accompanied us at every stage in the research. So specifically, we aim to research the effects of COVID on migrants or their descendants born in the Dominican Republic within the frame of the operation of the Law 169 and the regularization plan for foreigners, both since 2014-2015. We wanted to update knowledge on access to birth registry for children born to people who were supposedly beneficiaries of both these legislations before and during the pandemic. So another plug, the research is available in English and Spanish and also French. And I'm sure Alison will has already put the reference in the chat. You will have a chance to look at what we're talking about in more detail at your leisure. So to focus on very quickly two of the areas that we looked at, social protection. So well before the pandemic, scholars had begun to study the issue of the possible exclusion of marginalized populations from innovative social protection programs. In the case of the DR, Eve Hayes highlights the possible deficiencies in terms of legal identity practices promoted by multilaterals and the UN system. She cautions that policies that encourage en masse registration of native populations descended from migrants can also bring up the thorny question of nationality, destabilizing long-standing identities of people with vested rights to the nationality of the country where they were born. So this trend towards the exclusion of certain populations from social protection, which Eve portrays in the case of the DR, could be aggravated under the pandemic, as demonstrated in many interviews conducted as part of this study. Both migrants and stateless people who lack Dominican documentation have been left out of the expanded social protection programs that the government rolled out to mitigate the impact of the pandemic. Economic measures have mainly consisted of economic stimulus packages to mitigate the loss of income for companies and individuals with the aim of protecting employment. Programs targeting individuals include income protection subsidies to supplement formal workers, programs like FASE, Quédate en Casa, Paiti. Some social protection and humanitarian services have been cross-cutting, such as the expansion of so-called solidarity program benefits and the delivery of food rations in the communities. Now, the key finding is that among study participants, their inclusion in COVID-19 relief social protection measures fundamentally depends on their type of documentation and legal status. Those who are ineligible may be able to access assistance from NGOs and international humanitarian organizations. It appears that the government has come to rely on NGOs filling in the gaps to provide emergency aid for the stateless or migrants, sidestepping state responsibilities towards people residing in its territory, but who do not currently have Dominican documentation. So to give you a taste of this, Nadia, a 25-year-old stateless woman and mother of 3 stateless children, laments the exclusion of undocumented people from government programs to mitigate the economic impact of COVID-19. Despite having registered for naturalization following the passage of the famous Law 169 in 2014, receiving a regularization card, she does not appear on the latest list of people that the former president had authorized for fast-track naturalization last year. Her naturalization card is now expired. Her regularization card is now expired with no procedures in place for renewal or naturalization as Dominican citizen. She feels discriminated against by not receiving official assistance during the virus. She says, in this pandemic, the government has helped many people. Those who have an identity card are getting food and monthly deposits of funds. Any kind of help goes to those with documents, and those without nothing get nothing. My Dominican mother-in-law and neighbors receive funds on their card, government social assistance program. Whenever they are going to distribute something, they say it's for people with documents, and those without shouldn't come. I feel so bad. Sometimes it really weighs on me. Sometimes I say, look how the people with identity cards are getting food, and if I had gotten my ID, I would be getting funds and food for my children. Now, a second area we covered was access to health services. And the key finding here is that in the study, many interviewees reported having experienced discriminatory attitudes from healthcare service providers, leading to second-class treatment in comparison to insured persons who receive priority care. Moreover, access to sexual and reproductive health services for women is becoming hindered by nationalist anti-Haitian rhetoric, raising concerns about the cost to the state of providing service to Haitian migrant women. And in practice, stateless descendants are grouped in with undocumented migrants. In his November 2020 speech last year, the president addressed the issue when he claimed that the Dominican healthcare system cannot sustain the cost of attending so many pregnant Haitian women. Again, this may include stateless descendants. In recent years, there have also been military and border security inspections of hospitals on the border region searching for pregnant women who may be illegally using the services. Although study participants have not reported any personal experiences of abuse related to COVID-19, the official discourse of excluding undocumented people from the national vaccination campaign tended to create a hostile environment. In turn, this fostered vaccine hesitancy among a population that already has certain misconceptions, as is common among populations with low education levels. And in the study, both the Haitian consulate officials, social organizations too, that accompany migrants stated that pregnant Haitian women had been deported. They also said that migrant women about to give birth in public hospitals felt fearful of possible deportation after childbirth. Dominican law prohibits the detention of pregnant women and nursing mothers, which could lead to their deportation. Now, moving on to a little bit to see how all this ties up, links to the contestation from civil society on vaccine access. While processing the data from the research, the issue of equitable access to vaccines was being aired worldwide. It was clear from our study and official declarations up until early June this year that populations we had researched were not to be included. President Abinader affirmed that only people holding documentation, Dominican documentation, were to qualify. However, by early May, CEDESO, the social organization with which we worked in the South on the research, had taken the law into their own hands. For those without documents, local government officials were persuaded to take into account certification by name, residence, and age of persons anxious to get vaccinated and potentially excluded. Common sense trumped biometrical evidentiary ID in this case. All the while, quiet advocacy and diplomacy was happening to get the official exclusionary line to change, as indeed happened. The uptake was not uniform by the local bureaucracy, but did make a difference to people accessing vaccines or not. So, reporting from the coalface here, as I am in Santo Domingo, the changed official line for the better as of early June does not mean that the battle to gain equitable access to vaccines is by any means over. However, it does represent a change of heart for pragmatic, if not altruistic reasons. And as one official from the President's office acknowledged with diplomatic understatement in a joint civil society authorities meeting this last Tuesday, quote, "We have a deficit on the integration of migrant populations," unquote. Paradoxically, the state needs all the help it can in reaching these hard-to-find populations, while it has systematically ignored their proper inclusion to date. Interestingly, in the same meeting, civil society was equally adamant on what it needs from the authorities, namely a firewall between public health and migration control, reporting to the authorities on stepping in to stop the deportation of migrants who had evidence of their first dose of vaccines. Now, breaking down barriers to vaccine uptake for cultural, religious, or other reasons with populations who have low levels of education will be hard. However, interestingly, and this will be my very final point, the vaccination card is already being seen as a badge of protection by some against arbitrary detention and deportation. On consulting with Vox Populi in the mixed neighborhood where I live in Santo Domingo, a Haitian with 1 dose of vaccine exhibited proudly his vaccination card, acquired even before the official line on inclusion had been handed down. He seemed to believe that this was sufficient, while the vaccine he had required 2 doses. It was not clear whether he was unaware of the importance of getting the 2nd dose, or whether strategically he believes that not getting it might increase his chances of being exempt from deportation. As Eve has pertinently pointed out in this conference, do people really want an ID documentation? And if so, why? Are there alternative routes to inclusion for context, as in the DR, where the battle lines have been drawn so hard between pro-migrant rights activists together with the defenders of stateless persons vis-à-vis conservative sectors? Or, bearing in mind the adage to never let a good crisis go to waste, is this the moment to definitively jumpstart meaningful policy dialogue leading to sustainably redressing differential document access? Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Bridget, for that extremely lucid and insightful kind of overview that you provide us, and also for sticking to time so well. You've set the bar really high, but I'm sure our other panelists will rise to the challenge. I've noted many kind of questions and kind of thoughts as you were speaking. So I already am looking forward to the Q&A session, as I'm sure the other participants have also been triggered to think about a number of really important issues that you raised. But let's hold those for now. A reminder, though, that if you have a burning question and you're afraid you will forget what it was, you can always already include it in the chat. And we will come to your questions after all 3 papers have been presented. On that note, let's turn to our second paper. It's entitled Challenges for the Identification of the Citizen During the Social Protection Response to COVID-19 Pandemic in Brazil. And there are 4 co-authors of this paper. We have 2 of them with us today who will be jointly presenting. The 4 co-authors are Claudio Machado, who's an independent consultant, Ana Lucia Alonso, who is with the World Bank, a social protection policy consultant. We also have Leticia Batalo, who is a public manager of the federal government and a researcher in social protection policies, and Natasha Hornick, who is a research assistant at the University of Coimbra. So it's my pleasure to hand over. I believe Claudio is going to be kicking us off. So over to you, Claudio and Ana Lucia.
Thank you, Amal. Just to check, can you see my screen?
Yes, we can. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Congratulations for the organization of this seminar that is very much interesting, and I think it is very original, because we don't have too much discussion about the situation of legal identity in Latin America. So I think it's worth very much this the organization of this seminar. Our paper is discussing the situation of the identity ecosystem in Brazil in a large view. Yeah? We can consider and recognize that in the last 20 years, significant efforts was made for inclusion of population in Brazil regarding the documentation system. Yeah? Just to highlight 3 points, in 2014, the country achieved the coverage of 99% of birth registration, which is significant, because in the year of 2000, we have only 80%. The Cadastro Único, the administrative record developed for the social protection sector, include a significant amount of vulnerable population. Just to cite one data, was enrolled in Cadastro Único, was not enrolled in any other administrative record before in the country. So they are not visible for the public policy in Brazil before that. And since 2017, the country is developing a national civil identification system. In 5 years, half of the population of the country, a bit more of that, is now enrolled in this national biometric database. Yeah. So our research is how this new perspective of the existence of a national civil identification impact the administrative records using for social protection. And it's a research that we are doing to propose a model. Yeah? Is a study to propose a new design for the administrative records. And during this research, last year happened all the situation of the pandemic, and the country developed a solution for the emergency aid. And so we decided to study it because it can be considered the first adoption of this new national identity, especially the use of a national identity number. So this is the focus of our study. Ana, please.
Thank you, Claudio. Hi, everyone. So this is our target, looking at the solutions that the country made to achieve the who are in pandemic, though not in the registry we already have. So every time we find another lake, another gap to be in. So for this emergency aid, this way to help people to find the money to survive, they will launch it in March last year. We have a law focus on from legislative initiative in April, and then they divided into 2 groups, but it's more like the informal workers who is not in the cadastro. So we have this big, massive Cadastro Único social registry that we have since 2000s, and but there are a lot of informal workers that are not there, are not focused on that. So they are find a way to get through this and develop an app that everybody can go and register by themselves. So all the people who are informal workers who don't have income from last year can be on beneficiary of this new emergency aid in 2020. Caixa Econômica Federal, who is our bank, public bank here, goes to making the payments and try to help them with the claim systems. And the selection was made by the DataPrev, who is our informatic company, public company here in Brazil. And they made all the efforts to cross informations and try to be right in the selection and in the payments. And Ministry of Citizenship is the one who is developed the regulamentations and all the rules to do that. So we have 322 billions in last year, and by this years we are expecting to implementing the 44 billions, but we are not able to pay everything. So for the last year, we cannot distribution all the money that we are planning to. So by this years, we're expecting to achieve everybody, even if it's very small compared to the previous year. So we have a map and the distribution, and this is the coverage in Brazil. Remember, Brazil is this large country, and we have these 68 million families who receive the beneficiary. This is the half of the ones who wanted, who required in the system. And also, so there was a lot of people that was not able to receive. And that was our point here, because everybody goes and make the requirements. And when we cross our database, we find a lot of course, people who are not eligible, not in a criteria, but even if the problems with the registries, because there's a lot of people who don't have the identification number national as the one that they use it, and they wanted to have this number, and there's a trouble to get there. And so when we get this number of ineligible people, we are looking at there's something there. And then we have in conclusion data for 14%. This is changing because every day we have more and less. And there is a 34% that is benefit was not approved when they launch it, the first phase, and then the next phase they are failed. So we have this distribution into these regions in Brazil. We cross with our Bolsa Família program, was the cash transfers most common in Brazil, and then we have this distribution. Remember, look at the second table. We have from app, the registries from app, it's the most of it. And then we have who was already beneficial from Bolsa Família. And then as this emergency aid is a lot more money than Bolsa Família used to be. And then people have a migration, goes to these new benefits, and then they come back to Bolsa Família. And this is a structure inside the government. And there is people that already has registries. So just a minute, Claudio, please. Yeah, there's people who is from Cadastro, who already has a registry there, and has a criteria to be there, but it's the more part. Remember, you see that in the second, we have eligible from 2020, people from app, people from Bolsa Família programs, and people from single registry without the beneficiary of Bolsa Família. But when we look at this big Cadastro Único in Brazil, we find that there's a lot of people that is not there, was not their focus. And now we see that we need to move to Cadastro with another part and get more people there. That I can say that this is not the focus on the beginning of Cadastro. They are looking for the poorest, and then these persons who has an informal worker who has money and income, even if it's not formal, they are not on the focus of both of Cadastro Único in the beginning. So by now we can see that it's something that we need to achieve again. And of course, by now the country has these two registries and need to be conversions into one. So Cadastro Único, we have 20 years by now, and they mapping vulnerable populations, and we find that the already existing identity numbers was not good, was not enough. So we integrated with this new number that is from social protection, from pensions, and then we integrated and find that people since the birth need to get a national ID for social. And then that's why we have this NIS number, the social number for here. And then they achieve the search efforts and create links between the service, benefits, and programs offered by the states and its systems. It starts to the social protection launch and the policies, and we make it a conversions with education, health, and all administrative works. That's not substitution, but it's a conversion. And then in 2020, with this pandemic, we created this parallel, because when you need to launch an emergency, and Cadastro Único need to go to the families, and then we need to find a way that people can request the benefits and registry. So we created this digitally self-filled for applications, and it's not from Cadastro Único. And we changed the number. By now, the CPS, that's our administrative number, is now the identification, and the children do not have, and a lot of people do not have. So that makes them running for inside the country to go and take this number. So the CPS, okay, can you go to next? So CPS is the way to go to validation to check. So we have, if you are a citizen, and if you are in a bank account, if you have a bank account, if you have a job, or if you are, you have the CPS. But if you are not in this way, in this administrative way, you don't have it. So to validation, this is a good thing for CPS. You have a validation because every administrative database here uses this as a single link. So it's a good thing because you can cross the information and you can check if this person exists, if this is the same, if this family receive any benefits or whatever. So when they try to make this crossing to identification, if it's a person who fits the criteria, the verification, all 17 national database, it's a mess. And then annual income declaration, you can go and see the Bolsa Familia salary around. If you are benefits for Bolsa Familia, you are not an exclusion, you are in. So, and they also they cross with database for employees, public agency, and election mandates. Every database they can find it. And they can do it. So CPS was very good to do that. There's a rapid and cross-reference existing registries and meet the policy. This was what the CPS allow us to do. But there's a lot of exclusion errors because, of course, as I said, not everybody has. And the bureaucracy to get a number and start to be in a selection is not, happens for everybody. So there's a lot of errors and people are claiming. And if we look at the system of claimant in the government, we find that a lot of it and most of the complaints was about the eligibility of these criteria. And of course, we have inclusion errors also. So what you were saying is that 83%, because we have three phases in this emergency aid. The first aid is the one that cuts the half of the people who requires. The second one cuts only the people when you cross the data, we find different information, and it's about 20%. And now in 2021, we have the third phase. And now we are cutting again, because by now it's a very small portion of benefits that we will launch it this year. So
Anna, I'm sorry, I hate to interrupt, but could you try and wrap up in a couple of minutes, please?
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, so this is for the what is the benefits and what is the why they changed the single identification and why is it good and why is not good, not enough. Go, Claudio. Sorry.
Sorry, Amal, I will ask you for just more 3 minutes. Yeah, I will try to be very straightforward. So Anna explained this shift of the adoption of the unique number to CPF, and in our research we did some deep analysis of the CPF. Yeah, it was created in 1965 for fiscal purpose. It's the mandatory number for all economic formal transaction here in Brazil. Since 2015, it has been issued for babies in civil registration systems. And it was approved a law this year that established that CPF is the unique number required for access any public service in Brazil. Yeah. However, it's necessary to highlight some limitations of the CPF. Two that we consider really bad for concept of a national identity number. First one, the individualization is not based in a biometric process, but limit very much the accuracy of the individualization process. And second, what is very grave for is CPF has a status of regularity. So because it's managed by the fiscal area here in Brazil. So if a person don't pay regularly their tax, the CPF can be suspended. If the person didn't vote, because vote is mandatory here in Brazil, the CPF can be suspended. And for a situation that the CPF can be suspended. It's unbelievable that identity number can be suspended for anyone in any of these situations. So it's clearly a bad design of a number for an identity purpose. Yeah. I will not explore too much here. The identity ecosystem here in Brazil continue to be really fragmented. And the adoption of a number is not enough to structure the identity challenges arise, like the regulation of data protection which is very important. And we should recognize that Brazil have bad practice also regarding data protection and so on. To finalize, just some findings and recommendation that we write here for colleagues. The CPF should be considered the best number to work in administrative record, indeed. However, it's not enough to be adopted as a civil identification number. If this happen without a really redesign of the CPF, we have the risk of have some some improvement that we had in the last year. We can go back, and it's really important to understand that the CPF is not the unique enable of the interoperability of the administrative record, the administrative records, the coordination of the governance of the administrative record, and so on. The national civil identification creates opportunities for the design of a new model of administrative record. This is the point that we are trying to work on and figure out in which aspect a new generation of administrative records can be developed, because we know that Cadastro Único is an incredible inclusion tool for the vulnerable population here in Brazil, but it has some limitations, and we are trying to identify in which aspect it can be improved without great barriers for the vulnerable population. Yeah. And to finalize, really, it's not possible, because here in Brazil, people think the CPF is identity number, and it's enough adopt the CPF, adopt one identity number to have an identity system. It's not. It's necessary to improve the identity system here in a more holistic way. Thank you very much, and sorry, Amal, for run out the time. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Claudio and Ana Lucia. And I mean, I know you guys gave such a comprehensive overview and a real insider's account of the civil documentation system in Brazil and the challenges. So yes, we are a little behind time, but I think that was a very interesting presentation. Our final paper is titled Digital Divide versus Access to Citizenship Rights, Comparative Studies of Digital ID Systems in Australia, Brazil, and China in the context of COVID-19. Again, this is a joint paper. We have George Tian from the University of Technology in Sydney. We have Vivian Kelly Harbao, and we have Sandra Go, who will all be presenting. And it's my pleasure. I think George is going to kick us off, so I'll hand it over to you, George. Given that there are 3 of you, I would ask you to try and stick to 18 minutes, which will then take us to 1:10 UK time, leaving us 20 minutes for our Q&A. Over to you.
Thank you. Let me see. And thank you, Yves and Emma, and for your invitation, and also thank you for your team for organizing such excellent conference. And it's our pleasure to be able to present or share our research and learn from colleagues and through this platform. The presentation today, and we focus on the digital divide and access to the citizen right in the context of COVID-19. And in our presentation, we will look at the digital ID system and in Australia, Brazil, and China. And digital identity and is fundamental in human rights. As ISI report highlight, and so far, no internationally agreed definition in relation to the legal identity. It's same with the digital identity, no unified definition. But we found in practice at least two main forms of digital identity application have been widely used. One is digitalized legal identity documents, such as digitalized driver license. And the other one is digital identification and authorization. They have different meaning, and including the program or devices verifying traditional legal ID documents online. The success of digital ID program in every country is closely related to the level of digital divide and the internet access rate in every country. And COVID-19 make a digital divide issue and even more serious. Let's have a look at some data from the World Bank. In 2017, and the internet access rate, the world internet access rate is below than 15%. This number increased in the past 5 years. And in the report issued by the International Telecommunication Union last year, and in the developing world, and the internet access rate now increased to the 87%. Developing country, the average internet access rate is 47%. But if we look at the listed developing country, still less than 20%. So the digital divide and the internet access still constitute the major obstacles for the success of a digital identity program and in every country. In our presentation, we will mainly focus on two key issues. And first, we will compare the legal and the policy framework in relation to the digital identity in the context of COVID-19 and in 3 countries. And secondly, we will look at some common issue and challenge and every country have to deal with and include the digital divide and privacy in particular. Let me start with Australia first. When we talk about the digital identity and the aim of the digital identity program in Australia is mainly to help Australians to verify their identity in a safe and secure way and to access government and other service online. Australia already got a number of digital identity. For example, digital driver license at state level, and MyGov ID developed by the federal government, and also digital ID administration of Australia Post Office. Certainly also have the COVID Safe app and COVID Check-in app at both state and federal levels. Generally speaking, Australia's response to digital identity has been very positive. More than 1.8 million digital identity have been created through MyGov ID. The total population of Australia is 25 million. And through this digital ID, and the user can access more than 70 different government services online. And pandemic, and certainly is a disaster for every country. But on the other hand, the pandemic also became kind of a driving force for Australia to speed up the digital transformation process. Based on the data provided by McKinsey, and Australian business and consumer have leapt forward 5 years in terms of digital adoption in the space of just 8 weeks in 2020. Institution. Digital identity system is mainly an administration of the Digital Transformation Agency in Australia. DTA is a federal agency. Policy. The Trust and Digital Identity Framework is a major policy framework in Australia, which outlined a strict rule and standards for all the providers and the service within the Australian digital identity systems. Put simply, in order to become a qualified provider to provide a digital ID service in Australia, you have to pass an assessment conducted by the Digital Transformation Agency and this framework. So far, only 4 government agencies became the qualified provider, including Service Australia, Australian Post, Australian Taxation Office. Legislation. Australian is still in the process of making specialized law, particularly focusing on digital identity. And the consultation paper has been issued at the end of last year. And through set up the specialized digital identification legislation, and Australian try to establish permanent governance structure and privacy protection for the digital identity systems. In summary, one of the main features of the current system, Australian digital identity, is Australia is trying to use both policy framework and the digital ID law and make them work together to provide legal guarantee and try to strike a sound balance between the privacy protection and public access to the service online. But the reality is the currently state still play a very important role. Although the policy and the legislation, both of them have been made at federal level, reality is state and still play a very important role in the digital ID system right now. For example, the old digital driver license and even include the physical driver license, it all issued by state in Australia. Unlike most of civil law country, which is under the administration of the federal government, in Australia it's mainly administered by the state government. Having said that, and the data and the digital minister in Australia has agreed to work on the national digital ID sharing agreement, particularly establish a national digital ID system throughout the whole country. It's mostly motivated by the control of COVID-19 also. Risk and challenge. And although Australia is a developed country, and the digital divide still is big risk in Australia. And more than 2.5 billion Australians don't have internet access. And it's even worse and for the Aboriginal community. 1 in 4 Indigenous households has no internet access. So the digital divide and the internet access still big obstacles for the final success of the digital ID system in Australia. Privacy. The risk of privacy is mainly related to the COVID-19 tracing app. And on the one hand, those COVID-safe tracing app and provide a very powerful tool for the government to monitoring and tracing and spread of disease and control the spread of COVID-19. But on the other hand, it also brings a number of privacy issues, include, for example, the location of data and also the cross-border data transaction and so forth. And even now, and the Australian Parliament is still in the process to assessing a Privacy Amendment Bill 2020. The purpose of this amendment is mainly for address the privacy issue in relation to the COVID contacting tracing app in particular. The central challenge and still it's still just how to strike a sound balance between the effective COVID-19 tracing and privacy protection. Next, let me pass to my colleague and Vivi.
Thank you, George. So in the case of Brazil, we do have some regulation. We have a regulation from 2017 that creates a national civil identification. And so this digital ID in Brazil should be something that gather different documents as our general register and our voter registration numbers, our driver license, even our blood type. So this law gives our electoral system a great role because our electoral system is very developed and it already has a great number of data from Brazilian. We do have as well a General Act on Protection of Personal Data, and this General Act is from 2018, and it has some classification of how could be considered, what should be considered personal data or sensitive data, and how it should be protected. But although we have a good regulation for this beginner to this to begin this process. In Brazil, we say that we have good regulation, but in terms of implementation, we have great challenges. Oh, my daughter. Next, please, George. So here, so just some examples. We do have some apps for digital ID, but it's still from each state member. And I should highlight this one in blue, that it should be the app for a national digital ID, still under construction. And I tried to do mine, and I had some problems with facial recognition. Yeah. You can go to the next one, George, please. Well, we do have some challenges in digital ID in Brazil because still our Statistics Institute estimates that 3 million Brazilians have no identification. My university has a partnership with our local tribunal, and every year we call the population to resolve this situation of no document and no documentation. And it's still an issue that is cultural, economic, and now with the increasing of inequality in Brazil, this should be something that we should look with more attention. Another researchers from FGV estimates that a quarter of Brazilians that should get the assistance because of the pandemic couldn't, because they didn't know how to use the app, or they didn't have access to cell phone or an internet. So we have great challenge to really create an effective digital ID in Brazil. Sandra, please.
Sorry, China. And first of all, in China, the legal identity documents, the two most important one is the national ID card, or we call the resident identity card, and another one is a household registration book. And in terms of digital ID in China, two types. The digital ID card, it's different provinces started to create or digitalize their ID card, including the national ID card. But there's still no national level at this moment. And the one most popular one, or the one I saw, is the Social Security card. Now we have over 10 million people are using the Social Security card. But the problem for this digitalized ID card is you still need to have physical ID card in order to get a digitalized ID card. And another type of really digital ID or online ID is, I have this picture to share. Is this is the government started to try to make this network ID, and which looks like a card, but there's no name, no number, but with a QR code and with a particular scanning machine, and then all the personal information will show up. So this is one type of digital ID, and it's still in trial and trying to get it to people to have it. But as far as I know, most of the Chinese still, they don't have this network ID yet. And of course, there's another type of EID. It's based on another type of technology, and they can actually insert to the bank card and the new passport or physical national ID. And again, with the machine, they can read all those personal information online and or through the machine. In terms of institution to regulate the digital ID in China, the feature is China is not just have a public institution, but also have private institution play a significant role. And in terms of public agency, and Ministry of Public Security is always very important in terms of identity for the physical one. So that's why when they go to digital one, they still control the most database. And their research institute is actually the institute who developed those digital ID and apply those technologies. And we do have the State Cryptography Administration, which is under State Council, that is a national agency in this area. And but I want to highlight the private company, two giant technology company, WeChat and Alipay, they significantly getting involved because people, ordinary people, if they want to create their any sort of digital ID, they basically use WeChat and Alipay app in order to get access to national app. And another feature is to have this digital ID, always everybody needed to have this facial recognition. Basically, you need to scan, otherwise you won't be able to get a digital ID. And another feature is the practice is always go before the legislation, and the legislation is very slow. We don't have any national law to regulate digital ID, and I don't even think we have any agenda to pass that national law. But in China, it does have 6 national standards already passed in 2019, but which is more technology standard. As I said, even I said it's no national law. We do have many other laws as kind of regulated in this area. One is 2020, the law on cryptography, and to regulate the password-based those all events. As we know, the digital ID is very much linked to the cryptography. And in terms of privacy, there's no special law in China on privacy, and the Personal Information Protection Act has already in the process for like 10 years, and we still don't have that protection. There's no such law, but we do have this Civil Code 2020, and they have some provisions to protect the privacy. So certain level protection, but not really special law in that area. And the digital ID regulation at this moment is still very provincial level managed rather than national level. And so that's the legislation is still quite slow. In terms of COVID-19, I just want to share 2 health codes. And this is for people who are in China and they use this health code. And everybody need to scan this one, and all information will just show up behind. And if someone has already done the vaccine, and actually in the middle, you will see a needle, and they can clearly know who is already done the vaccine, who has not yet. And so just all sorts of information there. And one feature I should mention, health code is also created by Alipay and WeChat, that is the private company. In terms of international versions, for people who are like me, still Chinese, but outside China, and we need to go to this app if we want to go back to China or doing something. It's quite a complicated process, and it's very hard to use, and all sorts of information I just don't think it's necessary to collect, but they still collect those data. But if we don't go through this program, it won't be able to enter China. Next, please. Challenge, digital divide, discrimination. China shares all those normal digital divide in terms of internet access. But I just want to highlight one particular discrimination, which is probably quite unique to China, is the different type of WeChat account. WeChat account, like people in China, most of them, they have their account based on Chinese mobile phone. But the people outside China, they also have WeChat account, but they use the international telephone number to set up. And depends on which type of account, and the people just like me outside China, our WeChat app will not be able to use many functions in such as to create the digital ID, like a social security ID and all those things. It's one particular discrimination is there, and so that's the feature. The privacy issue is again share the many common things, but the one particular for China, the privacy protection is the huge amount of data is accessed and can be accessed or controlled by the private company and Alipay and WeChat. And so people may generally trust their government, but the private company, how much regulations, and people probably don't even realize the data is actually used or get accessed by the private company. So that's the.
Sandra, sorry to interrupt, Sandra, but it would be great if you could wrap up now.
All right, so it's comparison. I probably just skip this one because I think we covered most of it. But one thing is, I just want to mention the common law and the civil law. And the Australia common law country, as the scholar said, the common law country generally don't like issue the national ID card. Civil law country like Brazil and China, they do issue the national ID card. That's one thing is very interesting. I think just the last slide for George to finish.
We also do have some preliminary recommendation. And first, when we talk about the future tendency, and for good or ill, and digital ID seems like the future tendency. Here, we think the basic principle should be first, do no harm, or at least less harm. And some specific recommendation and include during the transition period, we have 3 recommendations. First, it's important to address the risk of digital divide to build an inclusive digital ID system. More specifically, that include it's important to make sure the paper-based ID surveys pathway are just as good as the digital one. It's also important to adopt the co-regulation approach for digital law and policy making and try to include all stakeholders, particularly end user, participating in the lawmaking process. Secondly,
George, I may have to, I'm sorry, but I may have to cut you off because we are running out of time now.
Yeah. Okay.
Could I give you 30 seconds to make your final point and wrap up?
Yeah. And secondly, and we think it's important to address the risk of privacy, security, and ethics, and make law and technology work collaboratively to strike a balance of privacy protection and online accessibility. And the last point is we believe it's important to adopting a more unified approach and plan for national and global use of digital ID through the common standard or infrastructure. And that's all about our presentation. We're happy to answer a little bit more specific question related to how and look at them in depth in the conversation. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you to all our panelists.
Okay, so welcome everybody. We have a fantastic panel 5 today, which is the second panel of the day, entitled Birth Registration, Digital Identification and Biometrics. So as many of you will have seen yesterday, the conference focused largely on ideas about concepts of belonging, on Indigenous, Afro-descended, religious identities, and we talked about non-binary identities across the Americas. And now what we're doing today is we're trying to link some of these core themes around belonging then with what we're seeing in terms of formalized registration systems and digital ID. So it gives me great pleasure to welcome 3 really prestigious speakers that we have today, who not only are very knowledgeable about the subject, but also a very work in the field, and whose insight I think will be of great use to many of us here today. So firstly, I would like to welcome Kirsten DiMartino, who is coming to us from UNICEF, and we'll be talking about birth registrations and the right to an identity as conceptualized within international development policy. And then a great friend of mine, Laura Bingham, who's from the Open Society Justice Initiative, will be talking on life cycle myths and the magic of the state in digital identification. And then finally, Professor Imke Harbers, who is from the University of Amsterdam, will be presenting her fascinating research in Mexico, which is entitled Uneven Citizenship, Gender Bias, Birth Registration, and Patterns of Political Inclusion. So Kirsten, I give you the floor, and I'm very much looking forward to hear you talk.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Evie, and thank you for inviting UNICEF to participate in this event. I'm very happy to be here today with all of you. So I'd like to start, by talking a little bit about birth registration and a right to identity as conceptualized within the international development policy, and really to share some of the experience from UNICEF working across different continents and regions and in different countries. So first of all, I would like to start obviously by saying, and I think all of you know this already, that all children have the right to be registered obviously immediately after birth under the Convention on the Rights of the Child. But unfortunately, we know, and our latest data report from 2019 shows that 166 million children under the age of 5, that is about 1 in every 4 children, has never had their birth recorded at birth. And we also know that that figure even goes higher up when we look at birth certificates. So we know that there's over 230 million children worldwide under the age of 5 who do not have a birth certificate as proof of their identity. Now, when we look specifically at Latin America and the Caribbean region, we know that about 94% of children under 5 are registered, and that 93% of children under 5 have received their birth certificate. So this may look rather high, but when we look more closely, for example, at the infants in that regions, we already see a drop. We see that 88% of infants are registered and 80% of infants have actually received a birth certificate in the Latin America and Caribbean region. Now, national IDs are used extensively throughout that region, providing helpful links between civil registration and other systems such as identity, health, social protection, education, which has helped to encourage early registration of children, as this may provide access to these other services. So while progress has been made on birth registration levels, steadily, and this has steadily been rising since approximately the early 2000s. More recently, we have noticed that progress has slowed down and is not enough to meet actually the 2030 SDG target of legal identity for all, including birth registration. We also have noticed, and we anticipate, a drop in registration rates due to the COVID-19 pandemic. In many countries, civil registration systems are not being prioritized as an essential service. They have been closed or not working at full capacity. And this is true not only for the Latin American and Caribbean region, but across the world. In some countries, we're now seeing that registration services are slowly reopening, following the disruptions from the COVID pandemic, but it is really unclear if they will be able to catch up on registrations and missed registrations across the life cycle. So not only birth registration, but also death registration, which is of particular importance within the context of an ongoing pandemic, etc. In Latin America and the Caribbean, there has been a rather high rate of linkage between the civil registration systems and hospitals. And this usually helps to ensure that children are registered immediately after birth, because it can be done on site immediately after the birth takes place. However, again, due to the disruptions in services during the pandemic, in many cases, mothers were unable to register the birth of their children immediately after birth in the hospitals. So needless to say, there's still a lot of work to be done to close the existing gap. And in particular, even though the rates look very high in that region, reaching the most vulnerable and marginalized populations, in many large countries such as Brazil and Colombia, there are still vulnerable populations who are missing from the civil registration system. These include indigenous populations, migrants, etc. And in some of the smaller countries and islands, civil registration systems have yet really to be established in a sort of effective and sustainable manner. And how to do this is still very much being explored. Now, when we look at our data from that region, we see a very, very mixed picture. We know that about half of the countries in the region with trend data are not projected to meet the SDG target. However, if progress is accelerated, if we intensify our efforts, we could achieve about 98% registration by 2030 versus the 97% if observed trends continue. Even accelerated efforts to bring these countries, such as Venezuela in particular, up to speed will not be enough to achieve universal registration by 2030, by the 2030 deadline. So really reaching the last 2 to 3% of children, which in numbers are many, many children, who are expected to remain unregistered, requires really a concerted focus on these particularly vulnerable groups, particularly the indigenous population. So it's really, really an issue about it's really an equity issue at the end of the day. So I guess you all know already why birth registration is important, but just to zoom in on that a little bit, we know that increased birth registration coverage has many advantages and ensures the enjoyment of all children's rights. It helps them obviously to be protected from violence, abuse, and exploitation. If a child doesn't even exist, it cannot be protected in the eyes of a state or a country. It definitely, as I mentioned before, facilitates access to services, social services throughout their lives and into adulthood. But it also provides the government with accurate account of the population, obviously, which is also essential for planning and implementation, development of policies and programs. And that is also, again, particularly relevant also in situations of crisis, such as the COVID pandemic. And finally, it also promotes the child's right to acquire nationality, prevent and end childhood statelessness. So we know that birth registration certification facilitates achievement of justice, health, poverty, education, and many other SDGs. And all of these open the doors, enable opportunities throughout a person's lifetime. So without this first legal proof of identity, the birth certificate, the most marginalized, including unaccompanied separated children, nomadic populations, border communities, migrants in irregular situations, refugees, IDPs, etc., are really at higher risk of facing barriers and being denied access to basic services, including social protection, health, education, etc. But also they face a higher risk of statelessness, as this proof is a critical step in establishing an individual's nationality. So it's really important that we preserve the child's identity by recording all facts of birth and including their family relations. As we know, the proof of family ties, a birth certificate provides that. It usually provides who the parents are in adoption. It gives adoption records, etc. This will help to avoid the risk of statelessness, preserve the family unity, and guarantee access to education and other services. Gender is also an important dimension of exclusion, as is Afro-descendants, ethnicity, HIV status, geographic location, disability, etc. All these shape the vulnerabilities of children and their families, especially indigenous and marginalized communities. Also, for migrants in irregular situations, asylum seekers and refugees, many may not be aware of the procedures or the necessity to register their children, or may even fear being approaching birth registration authorities for fear of deportation or even detention. Similarly, refugees and internally displaced persons can lose their own documents in flight, which can make it harder for them to register their children. They may also experience, of course, difficulties in accessing birth registration in the country or place where they are seeking refuge. And last but not least, also unaccompanied and separated children, abandoned children, often lack documents to establish their identity, creating again another heightened risk of statelessness. So I want to go on, of course, to highlight, the specific link between birth registration and childhood statelessness, and also give some examples from the ground. As we know, the possession of a birth certificate helps to establish an entitlement to nationality and is often a prerequisite for obtaining documentation and proves nationality. So individuals may be at risk of statelessness if they cannot prove that they have links to a state, and the lack of birth registration documentation and birth certificate can create such a risk. Now, not everybody may be aware, or maybe everybody is aware, that actually Article 8 of the CRC was initially proposed by Argentina when the CRC was being drafted, and really focuses on the restoration of identity. And it was very much Argentina's history and context which led to this proposal following the end of the country's military dictatorship in 1985. And this was very much developed in response to the separation of many children from their families during the dictatorship, during which those children were very much stripped of their identity and then placed illegally, adopted illegally by families approved by the government at that time. So in order to ensure that children are obviously registered and have this birth certificate, it's really, really important that we focus on strengthening the civil registration systems and that these are able to collect and record appropriate information in a complete and universal manner. Technology has very much allowed us to expand access and opportunity for registration services. There are countries who are exploring and implementing mobile units and expanding, technological solutions. One such case from the region is Belize. In 2020, together with UNHCR, UNICEF supported the implementation of mobile registration centers in 30 remote communities to really close that gap in birth registration, affecting the most vulnerable rural children, also Indigenous children. And UNICEF, again with UNHCR, advocated, of course, for the development of protocols to ensure that there was continuity of birth registration services throughout the pandemic, and mobile registration for the most vulnerable populations, especially asylum seekers and migrant communities. I wanted to talk also a little bit about the impact that COVID has had on statelessness. As we now know, the right to nationality, documentation, legal status, and equality and non-discrimination can have an intergenerational impact on stateless people, and children being likely to inherit the same lack of status. So vulnerable groups, including children, are more likely to be deprived of their rights because they lack nationality, documentation, or legal status. They may face heightened discrimination on the basis of race, sex, and other grounds. And this can cause and perpetuate statelessness, and statelessness in turn can lead to more discrimination. So it's a vicious cycle. The right to health, socioeconomic rights, civil and political rights really relate to some of the main rights deprivations that stateless people endure, and really have been exacerbated in many respects by the pandemic. So I want to share some case studies from Latin America, where really we have had concerted efforts to continue registration services amid COVID-19, so as to also prevent statelessness.
So just to remind you, you have about 3.5 minutes left.
Okay, no problem. I'll round up. Thank you. So I wanted to give an example from Colombia, especially, which is a very populous country, of course. And despite the pandemic-related limitations for timely birth registration, the government really led an initiative, Primero la Niñez, and continue to prevent stateless among children born in Colombia from Venezuelan migrant parents, with the support of IOM, UNHCR, and UNICEF. And as of the December 2020, about more than 50,000 children were granted nationality, with over 21,000 of them born between August 2019 and December 2019. We have also good progress in Venezuela, where we have managed to complete the delivery of 30 million birth certifications in hospitals in 2020. So really supporting the government to achieve that important milestones. So I want to go on, given the time limits. I just wanted to talk a little bit about UNICEF advocacy and partnerships. As many of you may be aware, we lead on, together with UNDP DESA, on the UN Legal Identity Agenda, which comprises of 14 plus UN agencies and 2 regional commissions. And we're really promoting a holistic system for legal identity for all, and which really covers the life cycle approach, is universal, and really addresses equity and equality. And this is really the One UN approach together with the World Bank to achieve the SDG target 16.9. We're also part of the UNICEF UNHCR coalition, Every Child's Right to a Nationality, which is focusing also very much on ending gender discrimination in nationality laws and civil registration laws. And we have a forthcoming publication on that we can then share with everybody. So in conclusion, just 2 more words, just to say, for those who are not familiar with our latest global data report on birth registration, you can find that online. And we call for 5 key actions to protect all children starting from birth. And these include providing, obviously, every child with a certificate upon birth to prove their identity, empowering, regardless of gender, all parents to register their children immediately at birth, linking birth registration to other social services, especially the health sector, as a key acceleration strategy, investing in safe and innovative technological solutions to increase access and facilitate sharing of information, but of course paying attention to privacy and data protection. And of course, last but not least, engaging really the communities to demand birth registration for every child and to understand why it is so important for everybody. Thank you so much, Evie.
Thank you, Kirsten. Perfect timing there. Fantastic. Okay, so really great to hear from Kirsten, who is, as you know, who works for UNICEF. So he's has given us the policy discourse and the rationale around the thinking to the right to an identity, which I think is a very important grounding point for us today. As we move on to now the two papers that I hope will help us create quite an exciting and fruitful debate after this, at the end of this panel. So Laura, over to you.
Great. Can everyone see my screen? Yes?
Yes.
Great. So yeah, I'm going to pick up, thank you, Kirsten, that was excellent and really comprehensive. And I'm going to pick up kind of with your last point, because most of my presentation is focusing on let's see if I can just, here we go, is focusing on public communication and education and outreach around mostly digital identification systems, biometrics, and how that links with some of these concepts of civil registration. And here I'm bringing, just to say as a few background pieces, I'm bringing a practitioner's perspective here that's derived from my experience researching, conducting policy advocacy, developing and deploying network capital transregionally, and engaging in mostly coalition-based strategic litigation efforts on digital ID, biometrics, and human rights. And in this work, just to say, we understand digital ID systems really as a form of public infrastructure. It's a basis upon which to build digital state technologies. And I define that concept of digital state technologies as those technologies that are really associated with an adjacent and booming data-driven industry or industries like biometric-based automated surveillance, automated risk profiling and social protection, financial services, and immigration. And just to be brief about it, the link here is that universal, non-pseudonymous, unique digital identities are really fundamental as a precursor to most of these digital state technologies, and the increasingly popular notion that governments should be running like technology platforms in the sense that they should be highly interoperable, data-driven. Because of this profound future impact that's foreseen for digital ID systems, it's become abundantly clear to me through my work that we really currently lack an honest and open benchmark for what good practice looks like in terms of public communication, education, and public participation on this technology and its regulation. Rarely does public discussion go past the solution phase and a focus on the initial design of the system to explore its full life cycle and operation, maintenance, and social impact. So my remarks today are based significantly on some recent work, especially that we've done, and observations in the context of Jamaica, Kenya, and the United States. And I hope that these can contribute to a sharper focus going forward on the role of power and disempowerment in the control of information about ID systems, as opposed to, for example, what information is flowing through ID systems. Looking closely at public communication and public participation in the shaping of ID systems and the narratives that surround them. And I think it's especially important, just as a last framing here, by way of background, especially given the theme of this conference, to understand that the manipulation and control of information about digital ID systems from the reference point of belonging and exclusion. And in doing so, really to understand that belonging and exclusion are politically and economically productive for both states and private technology companies, for example. And these effects have always been central to the shaping of identification infrastructures. I think a lot of other panels have covered this at length. So I adopt that stance throughout. It's informing a lot of my remarks. And rather than seeing the excluded as marginal or edge cases, I think that exclusion is really built into the design, especially of biometric-based centralized digital ID systems. A lot of them are designed specifically to eliminate fraud, for example, and to keep people out. So just moving on to some deeper thoughts about public narratives and sort of basic framings. At the outset, I think it's very important to point out that there are inevitable distinctions in baseline framings across, in terms of public narratives, across different geographical contexts. And because of this, lines can be drawn between, for example, open and closed or closing political systems in terms of how ID systems are presented and discussed, between countries in different economic development trajectories and sort of different geopolitical dimensions, such as the proximity to digital authoritarian powers and international trade contests. All of these can help to shape different dimensions or framings of how digital identification systems will be discussed. Very often, where we see the adoption of top-down centralized digital ID systems employing this mass biometric enrollment exercises with a concentrated procurement and implementation period. These will be connected with addressing the problem of lack of legal identity, as Kirsten was just referring to, and this mostly in developing countries, or closely related concepts of the problem of lack of state registration infrastructure, and hence individuals' lack of reliable documentary proof of legal identity. And a situation that is obviously closely related and goes hand in hand with insecure legal status. So this is where we start to see in public discussion and sort of public materials about ID systems, the conflation of many interconnected but distinguishable concepts around digital IDs and biometrics from states, intergovernmental organizations, vendors, and financial institutions. And that conflation is highly problematic from the perspective of an open and honest public communication about a system's purpose. It tends to be tends to be accompanied by sort of more tokenistic nods to the effectiveness and the promise of systems that allows people and people who are promoting these narratives to sort of assert an expanding and almost purpose-free nature of a digital ID system once it's established, because it can serve so many different purposes being linked to so many different aspects of state services, for example, and private services. COVID-19 has served as a catalyst, as has been referenced in the last panel, to dramatize the need for universal digital identification. And these arguments are used, for example, in the context of Jamaica currently to fast track the construction of new systems, and where they do happen, legislative and regulatory processes to establish the systems. By contrast, then, dominant public narratives around biometric identification in global north contexts, if I can draw that distinction, are really driven by immigration and border control, policing, and national security. And this has a tendency to actively and directly suppress public scrutiny of those systems. So in the United States, for example, where we have the second largest biometric database in the world being constructed, the Homeland Automatic Recognition Technology, or HART database, with an ecosystem of dozens of data sharing partners, including foreign countries, and massive computing capacity. Public awareness of the system is virtually non-existent. Privacy impact assessments are highly technical and reveal scant information about its actual internal operations. And open government and privacy laws have exemptions that really foreclose access to information about the system for those who are in search of it. So what does this all mean in terms of public engagement and public participation in the design and regulation of digital ID systems? Because mass enrollment national ID systems are intended to be purpose-free or intended to be harmonizing across different government databases, the public justifications are not static that we hear. And this tends to have the effect of splintering any organized engagement with ID debates because of the many different constituencies and perspectives, and the difficulties in tracking really what is essentially the purpose. And in parallel, there's an ongoing contestation between public health justifications or purposes on the one hand, and policing or counterinsurgency functions on the other of these systems. And this happens not only in national contexts, but also at the level of global institutions, which is further contributing to really an underinvestment in public education and participation when it comes to biometric identification and the effects, because a lot is bound up in contests over exactly what is it for, how should they be presented, what are their scope, which is especially the case in terms of sort of these centralized digital ID systems, which can have a profound effect on the structuring of society and political institutions. So just one example here, in the case of Kenya, where the NIMS, or the Huduma Namba system, was introduced through the Registration of Persons Act through a 2018 amendment, a one-page amendment, in a statutory amendments law, where the functions were listed as basically a tool to help serve in the operation of a national population register and to, as I said, harmonize other databases to support the printing of identification cards. So kind of a core identification or identity, potentially legal identity purpose. But following a legal challenge and further elaboration of the system, and after an initial mass enrollment exercise, the government's February 2020 press release focused on surveillance and law enforcement, stating that, and this is a quote from the press release, "The fact that NIMS is now interlinked with other databases, including Digital Registry of Licensed Firearm Holders and NTSA, the information," that's the Driver's License Authority, I believe, "the information sharing among security agencies will be seamless and highly reliable. As such, lawbreakers, rogue motorists, and licensed gun owners engaging in criminal activities will be picked out for prosecution at the touch of a button." So this consensus position that states can harmonize these digital identification systems or unique ID systems with mass biometric enrollment, with public health-oriented functions of civil registration, population statistics, has long-term implications that are not really being defined, debated, and discussed in an accessible way. And a specific focus for me and that I'm interested in, among other things, is the impact that this kind of détente has had on public communications associated with specific biometric ID projects, and in particular the appropriation by states of tropes of a life cycle of public services and support. And that comes from the domain, as Kirsten was just referring to, of public health and social welfare, civil registration. But it's used as a means to sell digital IDs by press release without really a rooted, underlying, necessary public consultation. In much of our litigation, this is just a reflection for me, as sort of cutting across the different areas of work, and much of our litigation is more focused on the right to nationality and the right to identity, absent a technological layer. And they're drawing on the international legal framework, and particularly the jurisprudence of the Inter-American system. We've incorporated the remedial concept here of proyecto de vida, or life plan, as a facet of positive rights to juridical personality, dignity, autonomy, humane treatment, all of which are violated when systems of registration, be they paper or digital, or some combination, operate to exclude and expel. So public communications that speak to the benefits of digital ID systems engage these notions of personal development or life plans by referencing a life cycle. But at the same time, press releases and other public descriptions of digital ID systems also project an artificial break with histories of discrimination in the very systems that will be digitized through these processes. So there's really a disconnect, which to me is, at best inadvertent, but also potentially dishonest about the ramifications, really, and how it links back to histories of discrimination and exclusion in these same systems. So then I come to my last point, which is really just to talk a little bit about myth and reality, and the effects that this has within narratives and identification marketing of these biometric systems. At the same time as everything that I've just recounted, there's a widespread documentation and recognition that a lot of the products that we're talking about are sometimes really comically oversold in terms of what they can do by governments and developers. Keith Breckenridge has pointed out in his book Biometric State, that I have quoted here, that when it comes to the immigration and policing focused biometric program of the United States, and he's writing here around the year 2014, but also South Africa over the course of apartheid and the transition to the world's first centralized biometric population register. His description hits on the particular character of coercive communication that I've observed, where some claims about the capabilities of systems really exist only in the domain of magic, which is a core element in the politics of identification systems, in that a system can motivate or can be a precursor to the expansion of state power and constrains the subjects of it, the people, the end users who are entered into a system, beyond its actual reach. I find this to be a really vital observation that I've seen in the field, but it's hard to describe as it's happening because the debates are so cacophonous. So my final point is that the magical overclaim tendency that I'm describing here also links back to a second kind of life cycle that I've been tracking in public communication about ID systems today, which is the depiction of different phases of creation of the systems themselves. The quintessential difference is that systems life cycle is sort of immortal and ever expanding, just like the purpose of a system is immortal and ever expanding. They're endowed with a kind of magical manifest destiny that's allowed to take shape in the public imagination and serves as a justification for projects to go forward, a kind of inevitability, which was mentioned in the last panel. So again, there are immediate and longer term real consequences to be discussed here, just in the way that that public narrative plays out. The reshaping of the relationship between individuals, communities, and the state, and constitutional order questions about political institutions that will run these systems and political participation in their genesis. So to close where I started, the strategic ambiguity that I'm pointing to here that's adopted by agencies with mandates to define and regulate this sector facilitates the phenomenon in national contexts. And that further impedes what I see as really essential, which is an honest and public debate about the value of ID systems. So let me stop there, Eve, and hand it back to you.
Thank you. That is just exceptional. Thank you. I really, really enjoyed that.
Next panel, where we have a wonderful group of panelists who are going to focus on issues to do with the Dominican Republic, but from very diverse perspectives. So it's a great pleasure to present. I'm just going to give you a one-liner on each person so that when the panelists speak, they can tell you a little bit more about themselves if they want to. So first of all, she who needs no presentation, Yves Hayes de Calaf, is the organizer of this conference and a fellow of the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies, School of Advanced Study at the University of London, and somebody who has lived, worked, researched on the Dominican Republic for very many years. Secondly, we have another close colleague, Alison Petrociello, who's a feminist migration researcher and human rights advocate who is pursuing currently a PhD in global governance in Canada. And then our final speakers today in the third and final panel, we have Megan Jeanette Myers, Associate Professor of Spanish at Iowa State University. And a bit of publicity for Megan. She has this wonderful reader, Border of Lights, coming out shortly, co-edited with Eddie Paulina on issues to do with Dominico-Haitian relations. And so I'm sure she can give us some information on that in the chat. And last but not least, we have Rosa Iris, who is an incredible activist for the rights of stateless people in the Dominican Republic, and probably known to all of you by now as the protagonist in the film which is being widely shown right now, Stateless. So without further ado, I will pass the floor to Eve to start her presentation.
So thank you so much for to everybody for joining me at this conference, first and foremost, and also at this Citizenship, Stripping, Statelessness and Creation of Foreigners panel. Now, the Dominican Republic lies very much at the heart of my research and was the starting point for and the inspiration really for me organising this two-day conference. And this event certainly has been many years in the making, and it's great to see some old friends who've just joined the call as well to watch this presentation, who have helped me along this journey. So when I began this project, I started with a very different set of questions, and as we discussed in panel 1 yesterday, this is because traditionally the Dominican case has been understood as an immigration dispute between the country and its Haitian neighbour. Yeah, I became increasingly interested in not looking at the case of Haitian migrants per se, but understanding the situation of migrant-descended Dominican citizens. So these are people who have increasingly found accessing their national identity card a challenge. So while the discourse on this case is often hinged around the experiences of stateless populations, so largely assumed to be persons either without their ID or whose status is informal or undocumented, instead, I've become increasingly concerned with the experiences of people with their documents. So these can be people who already hold some form of state-issued ID, yet are finding that their claims to citizenship are being challenged. So these are not people from elsewhere, people born outside or across a border, but populations born and raised in the Dominican Republic who, at the time of their birth, had a legitimate claim to citizenship. And many of these people even had the paperwork to prove this status. So this brings me on to, you will hear people on this panel talk to you today about the Dominican Constitutional Tribunal. And this is as our keynote speaker, Professor Wendy Hunter talked about so powerfully yesterday. So you can't talk really about modern day identity systems without understanding that these are built on a history. So institutions are built upon are built historically, and disappointingly then, and those institutions and state architectures were often built to exclude. So when Constitutional Tribunal judges ruled on the 23rd of September 2013 to strip Juliana de Gispierre, who we can see on the bottom left here, of her Dominican nationality, they took this decision because they were refusing to acknowledge the legitimacy of her birth certificate. So instead they claimed that this had been issued by mistake and was therefore they were identifying a need to actively clean up and reorganise the civil registry. And again, as we've heard in this conference, and I thought that's why I thought the last question, the question at the last panel was such a great one by Amanda, asking about, you know, what errors are we talking about? What mistakes are we flagging up here? And in the Dominican case, then effectively the errors being flagged up by the system were referring to children born to Haitian migrants whose parents did not use a state-issued ID. So the Dominican cedula to record their birth. Notwithstanding, the state still provided these people with not only birth certificates, but some also had national ID cards and even passports. So the point really being that instead of focusing on migration and otherness, instead I began asking why migrant-descended citizens, sometimes over several generations, were experiencing problems when trying to access their state ID. And by approaching this as a dispute around questions of access and inclusion, i.e. people who think they're citizens, yet the state might refute, disregard or ignore their claims, then this allowed me to centralise citizens within the research and as part of this conversation. So I wanted to understand why it was becoming commonplace to demand that people provide evidentiary proof of their citizenship status. And clearly, while these, as we've discussed over the past few days, these policies have been beneficial to the haves, but for the have-nots, then those left out of this picture, life has been getting increasingly complicated. And then again, to talk back to the motivations for this conference. Well, I started the call for papers acknowledging that over the next 10 years, over this coming decade, states will try to provide more than 1 billion people around the world with evidentiary proof of their legal and increasingly digital existence. And to achieve this, they're carrying out large-scale registrations in alignment with the Sustainable Development Goals, which, as we know, aim to provide a legal identity for all by 2030, based on the indicator of birth registration. Yet we know, we've already talked about the fact that that registration systems are linked to broader issues, and also the fact that even though the focus is on children, that ID practices affect people across the citizenry, so not just children but also adults and the elderly. So and we also know that in the region then, due to its experiences of colonialism, imperialism, foreign intervention, slavery and forced labour, identities, race and constructs of belonging in the Americas have been consistently reimagined and reinterpreted and regularly used for economic and political gain. So I think, as we talked about so well in the last panel, again, this idea of the expectation that a person's private data, so information that the state stores on them based on their race, their national and ethnic origin, also their gender and other factors, that this information can sit comfortably within a computer database without contestations emerging. When we know that in the region, historically, Indigenous, Afro-descended, income poor, and also, as we said yesterday, religious groups and women have all faced widespread discrimination and exclusion. So why, with the recent global push to provide everyone everywhere with a legal identity, should this be any different? So if we look at the case of the recent Dominican national ID card, so this was termed the cédula inteligente by the state, and as the director of the Dominican Civil Registry, the Junta Central Electoral, Roberto Rosario, stated, the idea is to link this card to our origins, our values, and to what we are as a nation. And I'm going to talk about a lot of these themes of Dominicanness and these constructs of Dominicanness and how they relate to not only state architectures but also registration systems and IDs as part of my forthcoming book entitled Legal Identity, Race and Belonging in the Dominican Republic from Citizen to Foreigner. So this book is part of the Anthem series in Citizenship and National Identities, and it examines the role of international organisations in promulgating the en masse registration practices, and then funding states to roll out legal identity measures as part of changes to their social policy. In the Dominican case, as we talked about earlier, the state has used cash transfer programs to provide all Dominicans with a national ID. And it's hinged access to these basic services such as state welfare, health, education, and the private sector, the banking sector as well. They depend entirely on the ability of citizens to produce this document. So for those included, for people the state has decided to recognise as citizens and give this card, then these measures have had a positive, even transformative impact. For those left behind, including not all, but some persons of Haitian ancestry born in the country, life is becoming increasingly difficult. And I think what's important about my research then is I'm not just assuming that there's one part of the population who are being treated a certain way and being discriminated against. I'm looking at the impact of ID systems across the entire citizenry, and not just on the island, but also where my research is leaning now, is looking at transnational populations as well. So how and I think that links very well to Olga, who was talking to us yesterday about Cuba and how Cuba can use its national ID system to make people stateless. It's important to think of this as a tool, and documentation can be a tool that states can use to weaponize, basically, and to treat its citizenry in different ways, even when living overseas. Now, for the book, I talked to people about their experiences of the new Cédula Inteligente. It was introduced in 2014, several months after the Constitutional Tribunal, and part of a national drive to ensure that all Dominicans renewed and updated their ID documents. As Martinez and Wooding have stated, this is a biometric turn by the government. Which I think is a very important way to think about changes in terms of previous attempts to discriminate against people were often involved physical threats and forced expulsions. I remind you that you can expulse a citizen, but you can deport a migrant, but you expulse a citizen. So language there is very important as well. But also now we're seeing a newer, more insidious form of bureaucratic violence. So these actions have literally helped the state weed out persons of non-Dominican lineage and administratively treat them differently, some as second-class citizens, and for some to exclude them altogether from the civil registry. And then when we link authoritarianism then with the ID card, there's a very important past of the use of the ID card. So it was introduced in the 1930s by the dictator Rafael Trujillo as a means to control, identify and racially classify Dominicans. Trujillo was responsible for the 1937 Border Massacre, as Edward Paulino terms a genocide in the Americas, because he effectively sent the military to kill on sight. And when he said as an attempt to de-Haitianize or Dominicanize the border, and when we talk about this idea of on sight, well, basically he sent soldiers to kill people who look and who were Black, regardless of whether they were Haitian or not. And the idea being then that the Dominican identity exists as this antithesis to the Haitian identity. It is one that is white, Catholic, Hispanic, and modern. This is a construct, this is created, this is something that is talked about by the elite and intellectual circles, but really it exists as a means to exist as the opposite of what the Haitian identity is, one that is Black, descended from slaves, with a history of revolution, and that has close ties to Africa. So that's quite a complex and thing to talk about, and I'm hoping that our other panelists will go into more detail here. But really the point being was, during this time, when we had paper ID, it was very easy to get hold of your documentation. So as one person I spoke to told me, all people had to do was look at you and they'd give you an ID card. So it didn't really matter if you were Haitian, Dominican, who you were. The idea was that the ID card, for example, the subsequent Balaguer authoritarian regime, used the ID card as a form to secure votes and for political and economic control. So we've gone from a system of mass informality to overwhelming formality, and that shift has only happened since the 1990s, and something that has had a major transformation of the way in which Dominicans are being recorded. So one World Bank expert that I spoke to, who used to work in the Dominican Republic, Samuel Carlson, he told me about how difficult and how politically charged the issue of ID was in the Dominican case. So he said it was the elephant in the room. There were people who were undocumented, they didn't have passports, they had children, and the Dominican Republic never wanted to acknowledge that their children were Dominicans, even though the law stated that you were born in the country. If you were born in the country, you were a citizen. And then the book then links questions of ID to social protection. So in the early 2000s, there was an economic crash in the Dominican Republic. There was a need for an injection of funds from international donors, and the country was really at crisis point. So as a means to kind of implement these structural adjustment reforms, part of the payoff that the World Bank made with the Dominican government was to say, listen, that if we're going to help you with your social policy, with the complete overhaul of the social policy sector that they funded, then to help you with the implementation of the new social protection plan, you've got to start dealing with the issue of ID and documenting these groups. So as Carlson told me then, he said the ones that were the most vulnerable, however, were the ones with no legal existence. So the World Bank pushed for that to happen. Now, I am aware of time, but I think it's important then to talk now about how central the ID is to everyday life. That doesn't mean that there aren't negotiations. It doesn't mean that people don't use very innovative and very creative ways of avoiding state apparatus or of accessing certain services, because they certainly do. But it's the fact that life is getting more difficult when everything is becoming centralised around the need for an ID. So as people have told me, you need an ID to get around. Life is difficult. They're no longer accepting the old card. And increasingly in hospitals, in offices, any kind of interaction that you have with the state or with the private sector, you need your card. And ironically, I think, as I was as one person I interviewed said, noted that, well, in the broader scheme of things, in the global scheme of things, a Dominican ID isn't that important, is it? The idea of the value of a passport and the fact that actually, you need a visa to go practically anywhere, and it's not really that useful. So why now, I think was the question I kept being confronted with. Why now? Why they're so obsessed with making sure that we can show our ID? And Bridget, how much time do we have? Because I am aware that we are on a time limit.
Yeah, you have 2 minutes to wrap up, please.
Okay, so I'll just share with you quickly that the idea then, this was Ana Belique, who was the founder of Reconocido, which is a campaign group campaigning for the rights of Dominicans of Haitian ancestry to legal identity documentation. And it's just this idea that's saying, you know, well, what am I then, basically? Because I grew up a Dominican, I thought I was Dominican, but now the state's telling me I'm not. So it's saying, but everything I have and what I am, I've learned here. It's an expression of who I am. To show how these systems can really throw up some quite complex issues regarding race, identity, and belonging. And again, the experience of a man born to Haitian parents who was saying that he was nobody knew he was Haitian until these changes came into force. So it's only with the fact that he was named and shamed in Listín Diario, and his name was published on a list of approximately 55,000 names that stated that he had that his file had showed up an error, that people realised that he was of Haitian descent, because before he hadn't shared this with people, it wasn't something that was known to his friends or his colleagues. So I think it's a fact that but this cleaning up of the civil registry has actually contributed to increased problems for this man. And then finally I wanted to share with you the experience of a woman born to Japanese parents, because I think it's important to identify that this is happening across the citizenry, and it's creating this then uncertainty in terms of how people view their own Dominicanness, their own sense of belonging. And this lady told me quite clearly, nationality is where you're born in, it's the country that welcomes you. She sees her roots in the Dominican Republic, it's her country, but then when people don't see her, they don't see her as Dominican, and in Japan they don't see her as Japanese. And then just to underline the idea around bureaucracy and confusion, that there were people who, even though they had their documentation, were sent to register as Haitians. There were people who didn't have documentation, but then would take a document from a neighbour to try and register. So there were all these different processes that were happening in the background. And this is just to show that registrations are not straightforward. They're not. They don't resolve problems for everybody, and they can also lead to all sorts of uncertainties, contradictions, and different experiences. So to conclude, therefore, I think very much the point that I'll bring back to what I was saying at the beginning then, I don't see this as a question of, as an immigration dispute. I see these contestations over accessing ID and how the state is identifying and effectively reordering its civil registry and reclassifying Dominicans as a question of pushing people into a social limbo. And as one person I interviewed for the book shared with me, said there are people who can't study because of this attack, they can't move upwards. So for people who don't have the documents, they're not insured, they can't go to a clinic to be treated, they can't get hold of a tarjeta solidaridad, which is what this lady's holding here, a benefits card, a social welfare card. And the rich Dominicans, they don't experience any of this because they have the money, influence and social status. So rather than think of this as practices that push people elsewhere, I think it's very helpful also to think about them as keeping people within their socioeconomic status, and ensuring that they don't have access to certain services and facilities and experiences that other Dominicans will have access to. So thank you very much. I'll just...
Thank you very much indeed, Eve. That was a really illuminating presentation, many issues. So without further ado, I will pass the floor to Alison Petrociello, who is going to do the second presentation today.
Hello, everyone. Today, I will be speaking about what I am calling birth registration as bordering practice, particularly as it manifests along the Dominico-Haitian border on the island of Hispaniola in the Caribbean. Excuse me. So this is a case study in a larger project, which is creating a global inventory of exclusionary birth registration practices that are affecting migrant and refugee women's children and generating a risk of statelessness. So this is occurring in spite of and in some ways through ongoing efforts to achieve universal birth registration and provide a legal identity for all, as Eve has already laid out for us. Well, I'll aim to do three things in the allotted time. First, I'll give an overview of the ways in which Haitian women's reproduction has been problematized in public discourse in the Dominican. Second, I will propose the concept of birth registration as bordering practice and offer some examples of lived experiences from recent fieldwork amongst Haitian migrants and their descendants on the southern border region, which was conducted in collaboration with our distinguished chair, Dr. Bridget Wooding, director of the Caribbean Migrants Observatory, OBMICA, and our NGO partner, CEDESO. Third, I will conclude with a few key arguments with implications for research and policy advocacy. So Act 1, what happens when so-called birthers cross borders, or as they're called in Spanish, often parturientas haitianas. So in this political cartoon, we get a sense of the political discourse that has been mobilized by neo-nationalist elites for decades now. It's from 2010, and it makes reference to Millennium Development Goal, number 5 on maternal health, and uses overtly racist imagery to depict pregnant Haitian women crossing the border into the Dominican, seeking free maternal health services. So here we see they're being scapegoated for the poor development outcomes and the non-achievement of that goal. So while both parents have a role in birth registration, I focus on migrant women because in practice, the mother's documentation and migration status often become determinant, as do social norms and legal frameworks around marriage, sexual and reproductive health, migration, and mobility. So my first argument is the story starts earlier than the registration or not of the birth. If we locate the pregnant migrant woman's body in time and space, we can map out what is available to her and her newborn child in terms of healthcare services, identity documentation, consular protection, and migration status. And at any of these points, we find obstacles, which are compounded in contexts where questions of belonging are unsettled or affected by structural forms of discrimination on the basis of gender, race, and ethnicity, amongst others. The specter of pregnant women using their belly as passport, as this border hospital director has remarked, to cross the border, overwhelm the healthcare system, drain the public purse, and claim documents and citizenship for their children, has been mobilized to militarize maternity wards and justify restricting their access to reproductive health care. Whether or not the expectant bodies in waiting rooms actually crossed a border is immaterial. Many of the so-called border crossers reside in the Dominican Republic, or were even born there and continue to experience racism and anti-Haitianism, as well as sexism, when attempting to access reproductive health care. Pioneering Chicana scholar Gloria Anzaldua's work on borderlands helps us understand how borders are socially constructed and can attach themselves to racialized women's bodies as they traverse borderlands. With the discursive framing of racialized migrant women as birthers and so-called benefit scroungers, the new lines of defense of the body politic move inland and become more diffuse. When women's movement is cast as a public health threat, images of waves of pregnant women overwhelming hospitals are mobilized to justify preemptive interventions in the name of containment and prevention of possible contagion or system overwhelm. So a number of policy responses have been derived from this logic. The headline on the left that you see on the screen refers to the mobilization of border security and military forces in 2017 to, quote, work under a new modality of service in public and private hospitals with the intention of evaluating the women who arrive to these hospitals in labor. Talk about mission creep. There have been costed arguments about the expense to the Dominican state, as in this 2018 report by the National Health Service pictured on screen, which were even referenced in current President Luis Abinader's 100 Days in Office speech, to which his this Listín Diario tweet alludes. A different framing of the issue was offered by the National Institute of Migration, which commissioned a study published in 2019, also pictured on screen, focusing on Haitian migrant women's access to and experiences with maternal health and family planning. And of course, there is a border wall under construction between the two countries, financed by the US, amongst others. Act 2, birth registration as bordering practice. So, of course, the main concern among certain authorities about pregnant women crossing borders is the prospect of their giving birth within the territory and their babies attempting to acquire documentation and claim citizenship and rights. Feminist migration scholars have argued that as status forms for people on the move proliferate, citizenship becomes a bastion for protecting state sovereignty, and maternalized bodies a site for constructing the boundaries of the nation. One location where this occurs is the encounter with state agencies, such as the Central Electoral Board, or Junta Central Electoral, pictured here, who are in charge of protecting national identity and in issuing documentation or not. This political cartoon from 2013 depicts a Black Haitian mother holding her son, who is literally depicted as a monkey and already pregnant with a second, as she approaches a white Spanish descendant male civil servant at the civil registry, who is apparently dismayed at her claiming Dominican citizenship for her child. When asked what the little Haitian's name is, she responds in heavily accented Spanish, "Not a Haitian, but a Dominican boy. He was born in La Barquita, and the next one I will have in Huachupita," both marginalized neighborhoods of Santo Domingo, where many Haitians live. So my research has shown that when Haitian or Haitian descendant stateless women attempt to register the birth of their Dominican-born children, the border materializes through discriminatory administrative practices they encounter in hospitals and civil registrar offices well within territorial borders. Subnational sovereigns down to the local registrar are thus engaged in the state's deployment of biopower, ostensibly to craft the citizenry they have the political will to protect. As I've argued elsewhere, and some of them are on screen, and I'd invite Bridget to share some of the links in the chat, babies born to racialized, feminized others are cast outside the body politic, leading to the intergenerational transmission of statelessness along the matrilineal line, even when the father is a card-carrying Dominican citizen. I'm currently in the process of developing the concept of birth registration as bordering practice to theorize the racialized and gendered ways in which migration control and enforcement are entangled in birth registration and the resultant production of a risk of statelessness. I'm happy to talk more about that in the Q&A if there's interest. My current research casts an intersectional feminist lens on the ways birth registration continues to be obstructed for Afro-descendant people of Haitian ancestry in the Dominican, despite governmental efforts to regularize migrants on one hand and naturalize their descendants on the other, following the crisis produced by the Constitutional Tribunal sentence of 2013, which Eve has already explained for us. So let us just quickly recall that there have been concurrent processes of registration and documentation happening in recent years. In addition to the so-called modernization of the civil registry, and its adoption of new technologies, which Eve has already explained, there has been a slow implementation, which has been riddled with problems, of a national regularization plan for migrants, many of whom have expired cards in hand at the present time, and a naturalization law for their descendants, which split the population into two groups. Group A, who had previously had civil registration documents, were to have those restored, and Group B, who had never had any kind of civil registration, were made to register in a period of 90 days, extended for another 90, for eventual naturalization. To date, only 750 children received presidential authorization for naturalization, and not one yet has documents proving their citizenship in hand. Statelessness does persist in the Dominican Republic. So, although some cases have been resolved, none of these have provided a sustainable solution for the historic problems of indocumentation and risk of statelessness. And a quick plug for my co-panelists here and their film of Stateless. They'll be screening it tonight at 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And there's a fundraising event for legal accompaniment under the hashtag Still Stateless. I'm sure that Rosa Iris and Megan Myers, who follow me on this panel, will give us more information. So our research question was, have these dual processes of regularization and naturalization for descendants enabled beneficiaries to obtain birth registration for their children? The answer is almost a resounding no. So the figures you see on screen are, excuse me. Okay, so our study had a sample of 50 parents of children born in the last 5 years with various documentation profiles. So we had regularized migrants and non-regularized migrants, which are these two sets of columns at the bottom of the graphic here on screen. And then we also had descendants in the various categories as defined by the law. And so we wanted to see what happened. So of the 50 people interviewed, they had a total of 196 living children, 111 of whom had never obtained any birth registration, either in Haiti or the Dominican. So that's 57% of the total. And when we looked at the children born in the last 5 years, the figure actually goes up to 64% of their children with no birth registration. So when we disaggregate the sample to consider the different documentation profiles, we can start to distinguish some of the effects produced by the regularization plan for migrants or naturalization for descendants in terms of the possibilities of registering their newborn children. So for parents of Haitian nationality, the regularization plan seems to have facilitated the registration only of those children who were born while they had a valid regularization card, and not necessarily for late declaration purposes for children who were born either earlier or later after their card expired. So 5 of the 14 children of regularized migrants, or 36%, had not obtained birth registration. And that percentage doubles for migrants who are in an irregular situation. 71% of their children had no birth registration. For descendants of the so-called Group A, who are pictured in the middle here, only one person who was interviewed had problems with registering her child. And that was because her documents his documents had not been restored. And the identity card that he had used to register previously born children had been suspended. So it's worth mentioning that the wife of this interviewee has a Dominican cédula or ID. However, since they are legally married, the official will not allow them to enter the birth certificate without the father or husband's information. This type of practice shows how, on the one hand, the arbitrary suspension of identity documents of Dominicans of Haitian descent does continue, and on the other, that children of couples with mixed status continue to face a risk of statelessness. But perhaps the most striking finding was that the situation for descendants of so-called Group B was the same for both people who had managed to register for Law 169 when that was operating in 2014, 2015, and those who did not. In other words, 100% of the children born in the last 5 years to descendants of Haitian migrants who are in a stateless situation have not yet been able to obtain any birth registration for their children. So apparently the documents they received by the people who availed themselves of this registration process have not yet been recognized as valid for the purposes of birth declaration by most civil registries. So if time allows, I'd like to share a few examples of the lived experiences of parents who are attempting to sort decades-long documentation issues in order to—
2 minutes to wrap up, Alison.
Oh, only 2. My timer says otherwise. Okay. In order to document the existence of their descendants, access citizenship, and claim rights. So these are drawn from our recent fieldwork in borderland Batey communities. So the first example has to do with the documentation experiences of mixed ethnicity, mixed status couples. So in the border region, couples with mixed ethnicity and documentation status abound, and usually it's the mother who has documentation problems, and men are unable to do the birth declaration without the women's documents. So the National Immigrant Survey has done a statistical projection of how many children may be affected, and it's around 28,000. But there still hasn't been any clear leadership on how to address the practical obstacles impeding their registration, much less political will. So let's consider the example of Luis, who's not pictured on screen, a 34-year-old Dominican father of 3, and he has not had any documentation problems of his own. He was born in Abate in Bauruco and is part of a family of 2 generations of mixed couples. Now, his parents, in the situation of his parents, his father was from Haiti and his mother was from Dominican, making him an Arrayano, as mixed ethnicity people are commonly known. He grew up between Haiti and the DR, but has made the Dominican his home and was declared as a Dominican by his mother. But his partners, and in his generation, his partners and mothers of his 3 children are both from Haiti. And because the mixed couple is the other way around, so him being the Dominican father and the mothers being Haitian, he's unable to get Dominican birth certificates for his children. The final finding I'll share today is around the intergenerational transmission of statelessness and how I am starting to see it moving both forwards and backwards in time along the matrilineal line. So first, an example of the backwards in time maneuver. So when Roberto, a 24-year-old Dominican of Haitian descent who registered under Law 169 to eventually be naturalized, he became a father during the pandemic. He was unable to obtain birth declaration for his now 9-month-old baby. So both parents are documented. He holds a regularization card, which has since been expired, a foreigner ID, and foreigner birth certificate issued to him by the Dominican government as part of the naturalization process. His common law wife holds a Dominican ID, but when she went to use it to register the child, it triggered an administrative investigation into the validity of her ancestors' civil registration in the system. It appears Roberto's wife has been subject to denationalization or citizenship stripping. The system is questioning the validity of her great-grandmother's document. The attempt at following the rules and obtaining birth registration for their baby are made null and void by ongoing practices of citizenship stripping, creating an intergenerational production of statelessness along the matrilineal line, all the way back to the bisabuela. A second example illustrates how the transmission can move forward in time, despite ongoing efforts at naturalization, and how a young mother refuses to let the civil registration authorities turn her children into foreigners. Nelly is a 25-year-old descendant of Haitians, born in Abate in Barahona, who registered for naturalization under Law 169. Like Roberto, she's got lots of documents, but has yet to receive any proving her citizenship. All 3 of her children, born in 2010, 2017, and a pandemic baby of 10 months, remain unregistered. She had approached the civil registrar, but got advice to wait until she eventually received her Dominican cédula in order to proceed. She says, quote, "I am afraid to declare those kids because they're going to put them in the foreigners book. They put foreigners for those kids who have a foreign mother, but I am not a foreigner and their father is from here. He's Dominican and she is the Dominican grandmother. And I have to be very careful how to declare a child of a Dominican here with that card," referring to the regularization card she was issued. The girl at the registrar's office tells me, quote, "You are going to have to hire a lawyer because they have not given you permission to declare their birth with that card. And those children, their parents are Dominican and the term foreigners does not apply. But if you declare them like this, they will be called foreigners."
Alison, you're out of time.
Great. So concluding, there are a number of implications of this research. And I'll just offer a few considerations for those who are working on programming and policy advocacy. First is that the story starts earlier than the birth that is recorded or not. We have to consider the parents and especially the women and their access to identification and to regular migration channels and status. Second, for promises of inclusion to be realized, any campaigns to promote universal birth registration must contend with the messy politics that continue to prevent multiply marginalized peoples from proving their identity. And finally, efforts to achieve universal registration must ensure non-discrimination and fulfillment of the right to a nationality for all, lest children of pregnant people on the move be left behind. Thanks so much.
We have Megan and Rosa Iris. So without more ado, I will pass the floor to both of you.
Great, thank you so much, Bridget. It's a pleasure to be here with you all today virtually. I'll try to get through my part in just 10 minutes so I can pass it on to Rosa Iris in a little bit. And sorry, if you're looking at my face, I got hit by one of my kids' toys in the head and have a couple stitches. I'm okay, but I'm glad my video is small so that that's not too distracting. So again, I'll note that I'll start today by giving a brief presentation that relates to an article I'm currently working on exploring recent films produced related to Haitian-Dominican relations. And in particular, these are films centered on the 2013 Tribunal Court ruling that we've talked at large about throughout this conference and the 1937 massacre. And then we'll shift, as I mentioned, to a conversation in Spanish with Rosa Iris, the protagonist of the 2020 documentary Stateless. And both of our presentations today aim to highlight the impact and reach of Stateless and other films, the intended audience of these works, and the representation of the plight of Dominicans of Haitian descent in the Dominican Republic. So just last week, Michelle Stevenson's film Stateless sold out at the Tribeca Film Festival in New York. The occasion marked the first official in-person screening due to COVID-19 restrictions, and one critic praised the film, and I quote, as a fascinating, often infuriating work of nonfiction, end quote, calling the documentary a piece of filmic revolution. The increase in films reflecting Haitian-Dominican relations over the last decade, in part as a direct result of La Sentencia, but also as related to the history of the 1937 massacre, a rise in Dominican ultranationalist thought and anti-Haitian sentiment, and recent conversations about border security and a Dominican border wall, proves worthy of study and connects to important discussions about who the intended audience for these films might be. Not to mention, Stateless and the other films I will mention in my brief presentation today can be understood along the growing interdisciplinary field of transnational Hispaniola, but also alongside calls from US scholars, for example, to move away from these gatekeeping concepts, such as race and nation, as related to, and I quote, a vague notion of Dominican racial exceptionalism and the country's strained relationship with Haiti, end quote, that has, according to the scholars Brendan Jamal Thornton and Diego Ubiera, transformed into a predominant idiom that might overshadow Dominican studies. Do these recent films, like Stateless, then, perpetuate this particular lens centered on race and nation in the Dominican Republic? Or rather, what do they add to the growing interdisciplinary dialogue and scholarship in Dominican and Haitian studies? So I want to focus today on two films, both of which premiered in the wake of La Sentencia. The first is Hasta la Raíz, or Down to the Root, directed by Juan Carlos González Diaz and released in 2017. And Alison, I saw you published with him. I'm assuming it's the same Juan Carlos. And the second is aforementioned Stateless. I should mention too that there are numerous other films of interest that I explore in depth in my article. Just to name a couple or a few, Citizens of Nowhere, which is a 2015 documentary, the first of multiple films that followed that highlights the denationalization of Dominicans of Haitian descent post-2013. And I should mention that Maria Cristina Fumagalli has a fascinating article that looks more closely at this particular film and other visual performances. That's in the edited collection, Border Transgression and Reconfiguration of Caribbean Spaces. And I know, Bridget, you also have an article in this anthology. Other films include Muerte por Mil Cortes in 2016, directed by Jake Keel, that looks at the illegal charcoal production along the Haitian-Dominican border vis-a-vis the murder of a Dominican park ranger in the Sierra de Bajoruco National Park. Another is Massacre River in 2019 that follows Piquilina, a Dominican-born woman of Haitian descent, and her family when they're left stateless following the 2013 ruling. And another is Needed But Unwanted that also looks at Dominicans of Haitian descent left in limbo following La Sentencia. So in addition to the films motivated by the 2013 ruling and La Lucha, or the plight of Dominicans of Haitian descent in what is for most their birth country, the Dominican Republic, there's also a film set to premiere later this year focused on the 1937 massacre. And the parallels between La Sentencia and the massacre are striking. As many have pointed out, and as Dominican Jesuit priest and founder of the organization on the border, Solidaridad Fronteriza, Border Solidarity, in the northern border region, Regino Martinez concludes, Hoy matan a los haitianos no con machetes, sino con leyes. So today, Haitians are being killed not with machetes, but with laws. Rosa also connects the two in her forthcoming essay, Azúcar Amargo, in the Border of Lights Reader, which I'll mention in a couple minutes, and a connection that she'll also address in her presentation. So at the mention of Padre Regino Martinez, an advocate for strengthening border relations and fostering community along the border, it's important to commemorate the lives lost as a result of the 1937 massacre, but also to recognize and celebrate the cross-border solidarity that exists and has long existed along the Cima of Hispaniola. This goal, and it's one that's described by my colleague and our friend, fellow Border of Lights founder and organizer, who's here, I believe, listening, Eddie Paulino, as part of a three-legged stool. So this kind of reflects the motivation behind the grassroots collective Border of Lights, which I'll mention briefly. So this idea posits that the foundation of Border of Lights centers on not just one, but three core ideas that function like a three-legged stool. Each leg represents an essential idea to the volunteer collective that is collaborative in nature and reflective of Border of Lights' mission. Alongside the objective of bearing witness to the victims of the 1937 massacre is acknowledging and celebrating the historic cross-border collaboration between Dominicans and Haitians. And lastly, the third leg of that stool is calling attention to and supporting the struggle for citizenship rights on behalf of Dominicans of Haitian descent. So just to give a quick mention then, and Bridget was so kind to mention it, of this forthcoming project that's set to release open access fulcrum platform in 2 weeks. One staple of this anthology, the Border of Lights Reader, you can see the cover there, is the shift away from a traditional academic anthology toward a more multivocal, transhemispheric, open access publication. So this means the voices of the protagonists at the border, both Haitians and Dominicans, the majority of whom are women, frame the pulse of this project. So relatedly, and I'm going to circle back to my focus today on the recent film and documentary production, the three most recent documentaries are female-centered. The protagonists of Massacre River, Hasta la Raíz, and Stateless are all women. So what then continues to intrigue directors to focus films on Haitian Dominican themes? Well after the immediate wake of the ruling and the international outcry that ensued in the fall of winter and the winter of 2013, the surge in film centered on Haitian Dominican relations has, if anything, seen an uptick. Recent media coverage about the construction of a Dominican border wall, the continued work of activists like Rosa Iris, both in and outside of the Dominican Republic, that challenge the national anti-Haitian rhetoric, both contribute to this sustained interest. My In Progress article includes a table that charts the rise in films from 2010 to 2020 that details Haitian-Dominican relations. These numbers have more than doubled from 2010 to 2020. So as mentioned, one of my primary interests is dissecting the intended and primary audiences of these films. While these documentaries released in the wake of the 2013 ruling push against the mirage that after 2013 and the National Regularization Plan that ended in 2015, we see, and I'm quoting from Bridget, your article, one of your headings in your article, The Seed of Anger, that says, business as usual, right? We know that's sarcastic. Business might have returned to normal, right, as usual, but it wasn't that way for many of those affected. So they also share with the public the intimate realities of the impact of la sentencia, the impact that this ruling has on Dominicans of Haitian descent today. So we can understand these reflections of the sentence as wide-reaching and as connected to a broader understanding of Haitian-Dominican relations, such as the history of the 1937 massacre. And this link that I mentioned before is really foregrounded in the majority of these documentaries. In direct reference to the 1937 massacre in the Dominican imaginary, Lotia Garcia Peña, in her award-winning book, Borders of Dominicanidad, approaches the massacre as a genocide of the multi-ethnic Afro-Hispaniola Rayano population. And in a chapter titled Speaking in Silences, emphasizing the alternate histories, in particular those present in literature, she examines how, and I quote, hegemonic truths contribute to the violence, silencing, and erasure of racialized people and their truths, end quote. Further, as related to literature, the massacre has a history of captivating the general public in the Dominican Republic. And we can argue that the 2013 sentence, has a similar pull or captivation, has similarly captivated the general public in the Dominican Republic and internationally. So in the case of the massacre, Freddy Presto Castillo's A Massacre se pasa a pie, Massacre is crossed on foot, which was written directly following the massacre, but not published until 1973. This holds the place of the best-selling novel in Dominican publishing history. As esteemed literary publisher and critic, and the founder of one of the premier publishing houses in the Dominican Republic of the 1900s, Editora Taller, as he, Jose Israel Cuello, confirms that when he addresses the extended readership of this prize text, he notes, and I have this quote on the PowerPoint, "Se vendía como recuerdo turístico." So they sold this like a tourist token, right? Venía por la playa y el sol y se encuentran con esa drama haitiana. So they came for the sun, right? They came for the beach, and instead they're confronting them. They've been confronted with this true drama, right? The case of the 1937 massacre. So if we understand Cuello's reference to tourists and as members of the Dominican diaspora and other international travelers, it's also important to note the extensive amount of work published from outside the island that reflects Dominican-Haitian relations, such as the 1937 massacre, but also other events, right? We can consider the Farming of Bones, Rita Dove's poem Parsley, or Massacre River, another novel. But such publications also extend to and cover less known events, such as the act of border violence in 2000 that resulted in the death of a group of Haitians traveling from a small town in northern Haiti, Piment, to Dajabon, and Evelyn Trujillo's 2012 play, The Blue of the Island. And I'll wrap up here in the next couple minutes. And notably, with the exception of Trujillo's play, all of these reference works were originally written in English and first published in the United States. An argument can also be made that the audience for films like Stateless and Asa de Raiz is centered in the US diaspora. A quick consideration of the premieres and subsequent screening locations is one of the key indicators. As noted previously, Stateless premiered at the Tribeca Film Festival in New York and Asa de Raiz at the Dominican Film Festival, also in New York in 2017. Just to give a little more context on these audiences, intended audiences, Asa de Raiz depicts the struggle of Dominican descendants of Haitian migrant workers in the Dominican Republic. Following the path of 3 women to secure documentation in their birth country, the documentary not only portrays the individualistic efforts of TCO and 6A, but also follows the social movements that respond to the Dominican government's policies with regards to the statelessness of thousands of Dominicans of Haitian descent. Building on the testimonial pulse of the documentary, Reconocido published a book in December of 2017 entitled Nos Cambió la Vida. This is a collection of testimonies that shares the consequences of the denationalization of Dominicans of Haitian descent brought about by the Tribunal Court's 2013 ruling. So Asa de Raiz and Stateless do more than show how Dominican institutional policies stigmatize and disenfranchise Dominicans of Haitian descent. They also call for a global digital public to advance an increasingly inclusive society. The screening locations of these 2 films since the film's US premiere include multiple US universities, for example. Although in the case of Asa de Raiz, the director confirms that the film's target audience first included Dominicans of Haitian descent. You see in the quote in the second quote there, and second, the Dominican public. While the documentary screenings in the United States, in this case, signal a diasporic viewer base, the documentary itself withholds commentary on a global or US-centric response to the ruling, instead focusing primarily on Dominican social movements. And I'm going to move to hear from Rosa here, but there's also a really interesting metaphorical organization of this film that moves from Las Hojas, giving the brief introduction to Dominican Haitian history, and then moves to El Tallo, right? So we see this metaphoric organization of the film. And then the Dominican American International response, arguably with a traceable role in the underpinnings of race discrimination in the Dominican Republic, and representing those directly affected by the ruling, represents a unique and still growing and maturing structure to this metaphorical organization. Although the root that organizes this film purports a metaphorical plant, Indigenous Hispaniola, its seeds have spread widely. US-funded groups like We Are All Dominican and Border of Lights offer one example of a refutation of anti-Haitian ideology and a diasporic digital response to the ruling. So I argue then that these documentaries in large part speak to and for an international audience. And then you can read that larger quote there from a personal interview with Gonzalez Diaz, where he talks about the intended audience of this film. And from there, I have still about half the time, 10 minutes, to move from hearing about Rosa Iris with a continued focus on Stateless and the impact of these documentaries.
Gracias, Megan. Bueno, my English a little bit, and I prefer talking in Spanish. I can do it better. Escuchar las ponencias de Eve, Alison y Megan, pues recoge en esencia un poco lo que vamos a tratar. Y partimos de los documentales, que algunos de ellos recogen el inicio de este fondo histórico que tenemos entre dominicanos y haitianos, especialmente desde el 1937 con la matanza del Perejil, que fue una de las denominaciones que se le dio. Y vemos, si tomamos la palabra del padre Regino, que dice, en el 1937 era con bayoneta, eran muertes físicas. Ahora tenemos una segregación desde el registro civil, como le decíamos popularmente en República Dominicana, muerte civil. Entonces ahí vemos el paralelismo configurado desde la intención de blanquear la raza, si usamos las palabras que en algún momento el dictador Trujillo había que limpiar. Entonces, en lo personal siempre digo, duele tanto ver a un país de mayoría negra como República Dominicana. República Dominicana, como dice, es producto de una mezcla. Sin embargo, nos cuesta mucho reconocer nuestra parte afro. Y al día de hoy escuchamos a muchas personas haciendo mucho alarde del origen español y de otras descendencias. Y cuando extrapolamos esa vivencia que se dio en el 1937 al 2013, en la aplicación de las encuestas...
Escúchame, Rosa Iris, ella y Megan, tengo una sugerencia de los organizadores, que tal vez podemos proceder inmediatamente a preguntas, respuestas, y tener una sesión donde podemos incluir la traducción para que tengamos más posibilidad de que todos y todas participen.
De acuerdo.
Excuse me, I'm just consulting with the presenters about the possibility of moving straight into Q&A so that we can do some translation and that more people can adequately participate in what's being said. Entonces, si están de acuerdo Rosa Iris y Megan, vamos a proceder inmediatamente a preguntas y respuestas. Y en cuanto que quiere responder Rosa, vamos a ayudar con la traducción.
Welcome back, everybody, to this final panel where we are going global, which sounds like the slogan for a campaign, but I think we should have a global campaign, so that's good. We have a fantastic panel today, this afternoon, morning, evening, wherever you are. First off, we have Amanda Flame, who is assistant professor at Michigan State University, and she is going to talk to us about DNA testing, citizenship and statelessness prevention in Thailand, which is an area where she's been doing work over a number of years now. The order is going to change slightly, and second to present will be Karen Weitzberg, who's a lecturer at University College London, and she's going to talk to us about datafied citizenship and biometric management in Kenya. And finally, thirdly, we will have Devasrita Deb, who comes from Assam and is currently registered for a PhD at the University of Otago in New Zealand. And she's going to talk to us about India's National Register of Citizens, and very much looking forward to that. Finally, we will have Jaap van der Straten, who is an all-round guru on civil registration, was the lead of Plan International's birth registration campaign dating back to the noughties, author of UNICEF's Passport Protection Report, and a consultant to many international agencies. He's going to talk about a subject, a slightly different presentation from the one of the abstract that was circulated, to talk about what he calls the data mess. How do we know if we are reaching the target 16.9 in the Sustainable Development Goals, with particular reference to Latin America, but also more generally? So I will hand over to Amanda for your presentation.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for staying. And I'm so grateful to be a part of this panel, and I'm holding myself to 11 minutes here. Let's see if I can do it. Can everyone see the screen?
Yes.
Okay. Before I start, I just want to, thank again the organizers, and especially Dr. Hayes Kalaf. I also owe a huge debt of gratitude to the woman in this image, Pibiju Morleku, who is a research partner and interlocutor and the leader, one of the key leaders of the Highland citizenship movement for years. My university host in Thailand, Chayan Baranaput, who's an incredible mentor, and to MSU and my Anishinaabe host here in Michigan. So I'm actually going to start with my slightly revised argument, which I owe now a debt of gratitude to everyone here, because I'm thinking through my work and thinking about what I've learned from all of you, and how it's helping me think about my own findings and work. So I'm going to use a lot of text on the slide just out of practice of working in Asia with, sometimes I speak really quickly, and hopefully this will help if anyone has any questions about what I'm talking about. So the core argument that I'm making today is that DNA testing as a new part of citizenship adjudication in Thailand is actually a part of a much longer process of depoliticizing Highlander citizenship movement overall. By individuating the process, it disciplines subjects to new forms of state power. It appears to delegate authority to the objectivity of science, which continues to cause this alienation between individuals, a citizenship movement, and their access to the state and power. And it's contributing to the elaboration of the infrastructure of citizenship and legal status into what is largely kind of, Thailand has a really global presence and a moral authority of health and its progressive health projects. So now the Thai Health Administration is deeply involved in citizenship adjudication by being a site of citizenship testing, essentially through DNA. For those of you unfamiliar with the region, the site of my work is in northern Thailand, predominantly in the region at the border of Myanmar and Laos. Highlanders are a vast, very diverse community of speaking over 40 different languages. And I don't have time really to go into talking about the background of, Indigenous peoples and all of their diversity here, but if people have questions about it, I'm happy to talk about it. I just want to say that what I'm talking about in northern Thailand may have implications for what is occurring in southern Thailand with respect to this really enhanced surveillance state and the role this conflict between the Thai state and some Muslim separatists and Muslim citizens, but my data really come from the north. And the argument that I'm drawing here is based on kind of mixed methods. I'm predominantly going to be drawing upon my ethnography, which I started in 2008, was able to pick back up on in 2016, 2019. I'll explain a bit more multi-sited, multi-scalar interviews and focus groups and document analysis. But I also have, I'm going to draw a bit on my survey work. This is just to give you kind of situate yourself in the sites of some of this work. So this took place in villages, which are often described as remote, but in fact, the infrastructure in northern Thailand is increasingly quite sophisticated and modern. And I tried to the extent that was possible that when I was doing work that involved large numbers of people at the same time that people were, willing to participate and saw that there would be possibilities for community transformation and involvement in the work. This over here on the top right corner and in the bottom right corner are kind of artifacts of the state. The top one being a district office, which is very typical of the Thai state. I'm going to talk about this. And the bottom one down here being a kind of very typical kind of document that replicates citizenship, civil registration, but in fact is not a real one, but was used by entrepreneurial fraudsters to take money from Highlanders because civil registration was in such high demand and remains in such high demand for long periods of time. And then increasingly, because I was following the story, it took me to sites of DNA adjudication, DNA testing. And this is only done in very few sites that are approved by the Thai government. And this is the biggest hospital in northern Thailand, where the CDC is based, where WHO is based between here and Bangkok. It's a massive, massive complex. And so we'll talk about what that looks like and feels like for people going in for DNA testing. To give you a little bit of a background about what is the state of statelessness in the Highlands, it has changed quite a bit over the time that I've been doing my work. So what I'm going to show you very briefly is just in the survey that we did, we had about 30,000 people by only using the definitions of who is eligible for citizenship according to Thai law. Over 30,000 people in a 70,000 person survey were eligible for citizenship in 1965. And by the time it was 2010, the eligibility, according to what we understood about the citizenship, we see the population is growing. And what we can also see in this is that from 1965, when 99% of Highlanders who were eligible for citizenship were in fact stateless, the proportion of stateless people, as a proportion of the total eligible, has continued to decline, although it stalls out in 2005. I'm actually just going to skip this a bit for brevity, but I'm happy to talk about these changes in policies if people have questions later. What I want to bring us to briefly is the fact that in 1999, 2000, there were massive social movements on behalf of Highlanders across these languages, across cultural, ethno-linguistic diversity, to call for recognition of their rights to be citizens on the basis of the law. And you can see that after this movement, this had the most precipitous effect on changes in Thai law and Thai bureaucratic arrangements, whereby a large number of people had their citizenship cases rectified. But this began to stall out in 2005, and the question is why. So Thailand is regularly lauded by the UN, a range of UN agencies, as being, a victory case in statelessness. And when I started my research in 2005, there were actually no words in Thai used to refer to statelessness. And now it's very commonly used. It's given in regular reports. Statelessness is an issue that bureaucrats in Thailand are interested in dealing with. But I think that this particular framing is really telling. Overcoming statelessness in Thailand, one case at a time. And so this is the argument essentially going to refer back to when we come to this question about DNA. So if in fact the Thai government has been making a range of legal and bureaucratic measures to address statelessness, why does it persist? And then how is DNA testing a part of the solution? So I'm just going to run through what we see here, right? So since 2000, what you saw in that database, Thailand has in fact expanded its paths to citizenship for resident aliens. It's streamlined its bureaucracy, its legal infrastructure, it has NGO buy-in, and now it has DNA testing. And I published this in a volume where I talk about the problem of statelessness actually persists not because of these efforts, but in fact due to these efforts, although I don't talk much about DNA testing in this. And I argue essentially that this architecture of evidentiary procedure is uneven, unstable, and always incomplete. And that DNA now is a part of the scientific solution, and its constituent architecture of documents, new kinds of testing, and DNA evidence are actually baked into this uneven, unstable, and always incomplete project. So this actually refers back to the keynote that we had with Wendy Hunter and her assertion that new, ostensibly progressive systems may not resolve problems if they are layered over long histories of intended inequities. And the public trust in this project is dependent on an ostensibly rational path to citizenship. So the ostensibly rational path to citizenship that I argue is really the basis for producing these inequities and in citizenship outcomes, right, is based on this notion that anyone, regardless of where you are in the country, you are registered in a household, you file through the village, you file through the district, you file through the Ministry of Interior, you go to this district office, it looks the same wherever you go in the country, right? And eventually you're issued this ID card, the coveted biometric ID card. Because I want to get to DNA, what I'm just going to say here is say that I can show you, if you're interested, about how, despite this claim to rationality that things are through the evidentiary procedure, there are massive instabilities that are institutional across these levels. There are geographic instabilities that occur across, it really depends. It should not matter where you are in the country and your basis, your access to citizenship, but statistical and ethnographic evidence indicate that in fact it matters a lot. And this is controlling for a number of variables. And the last one is intergenerational instabilities. And what I want to say about that is that intergenerational instabilities refer to the ostensibly easy claim of citizenship by blood or parentage, but gaps and inaccuracies in registration, even within generations, have produced instabilities in claims and status that persist. And these intergenerational claims of citizenship via parentage, right, that references and citizenship that it references are in fact unstable because they're ultimately impossible, and I would argue by design. So what I could show if I had time is that there are a range, thousands of people were left out of registration campaigns, they were excluded from registration campaigns, all kinds of things that other people have identified. And of course, the intergenerational project is that this produces lack of legal status. And this references, I think, what Anderson argues is that the nation is a project and construct of historical revisionism, and that identities must not only be reconciled to territory, but also backward through history. And that is where we enter into DNA. So I know I only have 1 minute, but in fact, that's all I need. So is it technically a better solution, right? This is really the idea that DNA is going to help solve this because it removes the kind of the juridical and adjudicative unevenness that is afforded to appointed officials. It's supposed to be scientifically robust, completely reliable, and it's done by scientists, it's done by doctors. And so this is really celebrated not only by the state itself, but NGOs have really lauded this. The problem, of course, in this is that it's, one, extremely expensive, and people have to pay for this by themselves. The process is also extremely timely. You must get approval and a request from the district official to travel from your village to the district office and then go to one of the approved hospitals, which is really far away. Very importantly, the only place you can do your DNA testing is in the Department of Forensics, which is next to a mortuary, which for Thai people is extremely difficult and awful place to go. You would never go there if you didn't have to go. I have to wrap up. So this is just images of going through this extremely convoluted and alienating process of getting DNA testing. So basically, in conclusion, right, I'm saying that the problem persists due to rationalization. The scientific solution and its constituent architecture of documents, testing, and DNA evidence are actually, in fact, constitutive of the uneven and racist project it was intended to improve. DNA testing is part of a longer process of depoliticizing Highlander citizenship movements. It alienates claimants from claims and authority, appears to delegate authority to the objectivity of science and the moral authority of physicians, and elaborates and complicates this vast infrastructure of citizenship and legal status to the authority of Thai health ministers. So I will end here, and I'm so excited for questions and really grateful for your time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amanda. I have so many questions about why is DNA even relevant, but I'll have to park them and wait till we get to the discussion. I'll move straight on to Karen Weitzberg and presentation on Kenya.
Thank you. Let me just share my screen. Is everyone able to see that?
Yes.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you so much, Bronwyn, and thank you, Amanda, for really a fascinating presentation with a lot of really interesting parallels, I think, with DNA testing for refugee resettlement. I apologize for not only being able to sporadically attend this conference because I've had, unfortunately, back-to-back meetings today and yesterday, but I can assure you I would much rather have attended the conference in greater depth, but I'm excited to be here and to speak to you about one aspect of an ongoing project that I'm working on about the history of biometrics in Kenya, which dates back well over a century. And I think in that respect, there's lots of parallels with Latin America. My caveat is that my ideas are still very preliminary, and I think that will become apparent as I present, in part because this is in many ways a stalled project. My subsequent research trip to Kenya has been delayed now twice because of COVID. And I've been working on some other projects, but putting together this presentation has been really helpful for me in terms of thinking through ideas that I've been putting on hold for a while. So the kind of key questions that I'd like to talk about today has to do with something I've been thinking about for a while, which is the extent to which datafication, the move from analog to digital biometrics, specifically fingerprinting, but also iris biometrics, as well as growing interoperability. To what extent is it changing the way in which citizenship itself is understood and fought over in Kenya? And the question of citizenship, especially for populations who've long historically been excluded from accessing ID cards and other forms of legal identification, has often been a very fraught issue. And in thinking about this issue, I'm drawing quite a bit on Masiero and Shakti's recent article about the Aadhaar system. And there are a lot of very interesting parallels between India and Kenya, in which they talk about this concept of coded citizenship. And they draw upon a number of other scholars in talking about how the Aadhaar system kind of brought about the idea of citizens as being legible as machine-readable data ensembles. They speak about the datafication of populations, the transformation of discrete populations into uniquely identifiable subjects through biometric systems, and then the tensions this ultimately produces between the idea of both uniqueness, individual uniqueness, and administrative collective manageability. And in today's presentation, and I'm going to try to be brief, I want to talk about a kind of subset of this larger issue, which is a question, again, that I'm still toying with, which is to what extent are recent processes happening in Kenya around datafication and the move towards the digitization of biometrics, to what extent are they changing the claims-making strategies of those who have faced historic exclusion from identification systems? And as Bronwyn and I think several other people on this panel no doubt know, there are several populations in Kenya who have historically faced numerous obstacles to accessing, for example, Kenyan IDs. These tend to be predominantly Muslim populations often described or sometimes self-described as border communities. And I'm particularly interested in how these populations are responding to these new forms of digital identity. So the case study that I want to talk about today is based on ongoing research that I've been doing, much of it with a group called Privacy International, which is based here in London. And it has to do with this, what's often referred to as the problem of double registration. So to kind of briefly sum up the situation with double registration in Kenya, there are really, for several years now, and an indeterminate number, we don't quite know the exact number, but tens of thousands of Kenyan citizens who can't access national IDs because their biometrics are in both the Kenyan refugee database and the UNHCR database. For many years, a lot of Kenyans, especially ethnic Somali Kenyan citizens, would slip in and out of the refugee system and be able to kind of, largely because these systems didn't really speak to one another, be able to both simultaneously at different moments claim refugee status, but also claim citizenship status. And their reasons for doing so are complex. A lot of it is tied to historic marginalization in northern Kenya. A lot of it has to do with the fact that when the influx of Somali refugees came into Kenya in the late 80s, early 90s with the start of the Somali Civil War, this coincided with periodic drought. So people very strategically turned to the refugee system, often in some cases out of desperation, often strategically in order to, because many saw it as a route towards resettlement. And this speaks to kind of much broader issues that I don't have time to delve into about global inequality in access to resources and freedom of movement, et cetera. But really with both the rise of biometric registration, which has been touted as primarily an anti-fraud effort, and with growing interoperability between the UNHCR and the Kenyan government, growing data sharing, as well as funding and support, and capacity building between the UNHCR and the Kenyan government, the national system and the refugee system became increasingly intertwined, to the point that now the Kenyan government has its own, interestingly enough, ink-based scanned biometric system in its AFIS system, and people can be cross-checked when they apply for national IDs against the refugee database. And what this has meant is that now tens of thousands of people are really are stuck in this legal limbo as a result of this new kind of biometric interoperability. Now, on one hand, this is a very old story. This is a story about Somali populations who have historically been excluded from accessing IDs, yet again facing barriers to being accepted as full-fledged Kenyan citizens, which is a status that many people associate with having an ID. But there's also much that is new about this process. So this is a process of exclusion that is being done through a kind of automated biometric deduplication process. And there's lots to be said about this. You can see on the right, there's some photographs from that two Kenyan photographers took when I was in Garissa during what's known as a vetting process, and I can touch on that more during Q&A. But there's lots to be said about the kind of overlap and entanglement between Kenya's kind of ink-based analog system and the digitized UNHCR system, which you can see on the left and right in these two different photographs. But one of the things that really intrigues me about this moment is how this process of automated deduplication, this supposedly individualizing biometric process meant to root out quote unquote fraud, is also leading to new kinds of communal claims making. And one of the interesting things that I've seen is how people are really mobilizing around a new kind of category of exclusion, which is the idea of being, as they often refer to themselves, victims of double registration. It's also enabling them to kind of internationalize very long-standing debates and concerns around their tenuous claims to citizenship. So rather than just being able to make claims on the Kenyan state, they're also be able to make claims and demands on the UNHCR, who in a whole host of ways is implicated in this problem. And I've seen kind of parallels to this in other cases in Kenya. So if we look, for example, at the rollout of what's known as a Huduma number system, Huduma number is somewhat analogous to the Aadhaar system in Kenya. There's some notable differences, but it's a rather controversial new biometric registration program that was rolled out in 2019. Kenyans are just now picking up their smart Huduma number cards, although it's very unclear how much the system will actually prove to be effective. But one of the very interesting things that happened during the controversy over the rollout of Huduma number was that a number of groups, such as the Nubian community, represented through this group known as the Nubian Rights Forum, began to mobilize politically, and actually very much drawing upon the example of the Supreme Court case in India that challenged Aadhaar, posed a legislative challenge to Huduma number in the Kenyan High Court. And all sorts of really fascinating transnational alliances emerged out of those court cases, with international NGOs supporting these groups behind the scenes. And to be clear, I'm a bit implicated in these alliances because I work with some of the civil society groups involved, but as well as kind of active recruiting of expert witnesses who were involved in the Indian Supreme Court case, as well as the kind of reframing and a tapping into a global discourse. So groups like the Nubian community, who like the Somali community have faced historic discrimination in accessing IDs, were able to, in many ways, elevate their grievances and reframe their issues around a question of data protection, of digital rights, and gain a kind of new kind of visibility within Kenyan debates. I'm running out of time, so I'm just going to quickly conclude with some final thoughts. All of this is to say that I am really interested in this question of how the global push for digital ID might be leading to the formation of new kinds of transnational organization, new forms of rhetorical strategies, the creation of new categories of excluded constituencies. And I think in some ways this complicates the typical narrative of digital ID amplifying existing kinds of exclusion. I generally think that's true. I generally think that the rollout of digital ID has raised the stakes and tended to exacerbate problems of exclusion. But I also think we need to see this flip side, which is to see how people are kind of mobilizing, internationalizing their grievances around identification and reframing their debates within this language of universality around legal identity. So I'm going to stop there. And looking forward to
Thank you very much, Karen. That was a great presentation. The international frameworks always shape national debates. I'm reminded, also relevant in Kenya, that some groups have sort of reinvented themselves as Indigenous because that's an argument that gives leverage at the international level where they hadn't previously thought of themselves in those ways. And I think that's a really interesting way in which the conversations happen between national and international. Anyway, I shall hand over to Debashrita Deb to talk to us about Assam and the National Register of Citizens in India generally.
Okay, so I'll quickly start sharing my screen, and I apologize beforehand if my PowerPoint just messes up right in the beginning.
Nope, that's good, we can see.
Okay, okay. So a very good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone present here. So yeah, I think the problem has started. Okay, so the title of my presentation is From Citizens to Stateless, Crisis, Othering, Persecution, and the Complex Reality in India's National Register of Citizens. I think there's a glitch with PowerPoint, so then the slide keeps on. Yeah, okay.
Are you accidentally pressing down the space bar or something?
No, I don't know. Something is wrong. Okay, so for the moment, I don't know. It's just working berserk.
I have the presentation, so let me try.
So I am very, very sorry for the loss in time. I'm extremely sorry. So Bronwyn, should I stop sharing my screen?
I have just stopped you, so.
Okay, great.
Can you see?
It's started, yeah. It's just started, yeah. So yeah, the title of my presentation is From Citizens to Stateless, Crisis, Othering, Persecution, and the Complex Realities in India's National Register of Citizens. So Jade Roberts yesterday through her presentation had basically laid the groundwork for my today's presentation. So without any further ado, I'll just quickly move on to this discussion. So the research, under the research design, the pre-question that I'll try to address to my presentation is, how has the National Register of Citizens in Assam created what we call a crisis in the state? And as a methodology, I have basically used semi-structured interviews of people, whereby I have interviewed more than 60 people in Assam who had been excluded from the NRC list, besides the discourse analysis of government speeches and media reports on the issue. And my presentation today will draw from the narratives of the interviews of people who had been left out of the NRC, or the National Register of Citizens. Now, so to begin, what exactly is the NRC? Now, in his book, Insiders and Outsiders, Citizenship, Xenophobia in Contemporary Southern Africa, Francis Nimjo lists the arrests of people for being too black or for having a foreign name, or in one case, walking like a Mozambican. A similar religious, racial, and linguistic targeting happened in the NRC process in the Indian state of Assam since 2015, which has basically resulted in the arresting of Indian nationals of Bengali ethnic origin, several of them who have had to spend several days in the detention camp fighting tooth and nail to convince the Indian state of their legitimate status as Indian citizens and not as Bangladeshi infiltrators. Now, this exercise was the first of its kind in the history of India, as it reimagined how the Indian state relates to its citizens. Now, the contemporary exercise of documenting genuine citizens in Assam through the NRC to cleanse the state of illegal immigrants has excluded more than 1.9 million people and who turned suspect citizens overnight. And it has effectively called into question their citizenship, leaving them in a state of limbo, and who have been pushed to a subhuman level, or as Giorgio Agamben notes, the bare life, putting them at a risk of becoming stateless. Now, the process has resulted in the loss of lives of hundreds of citizens over the anxiety over losing their citizenship status. Now, this process was conceptualized and ideologically supported as an essential tool to check undocumented illegal migration into Assam, which it was believed threatened the interest of the indigenous people of the state. And this is how the policy was seen as being acceptable and mainstreamed across the political spectrum. Bronwyn, if you could just, change the screen, slide. Okay, so the fractious and flawed implementation that marked the exercise has placed a much needed spotlight on the deeply fraught processes through which citizenship is constructed and experienced, especially by those in the margins in contemporary India. Most importantly, a vast majority of those who were excluded were poor and illiterate, and for whom the intricacies of the exercise proved extremely difficult. So here on screen, you will be seeing how the fear of the migrant is something which has shaped the contemporary exercise of the NRC. The use of words like land-hungry immigrants or like vultures or ants. And in the next slide, in another statement by S.K. Sinha, the very fact about illegal immigration is seen as a threat to the national security. So all of these have paved the way for the contemporary citizenship determination process in Assam. Now, while the demand for the NRC was conditioned, if you could just change the screen, Bronwyn. Yeah, so now I begin with the inside story of loss, death, and despair, which will basically show what exactly is the crisis that has been created. Now, while the demand for NRC was conditioned by Assam's contentious history as well as its checkered past, marked by conflicts over migration, identity, ethnicity, as well as resource sharing, this statist exercise, guided by the documented dominant paradigm of homogenizing experiences of victimhood and a collective history of deprivation weaved by the Assamese populace, has shaped the documented history of the region, and it has overlooked and overshadowed the untold and unrecognized memories and sufferings of the peripheral population in Assam, especially the Bengalis, who are an ethno-linguistic minority of the state and are stigmatized as Bangladeshis and foreigners, and who have been at the crossroads of this exercise, and whose lives have been torn apart again and again by the social exclusions, as well as political, linguistic, and ethnic conflicts since the post-colonial era. Now, against this backdrop, leaning on fieldwork experience collected through semi-structured interviews of people left out of the NRC, in one of the towns of Silchar, which is largely inhabited by a Bengali-speaking populace, my presentation basically seeks to uncover the variegated accounts of strike, trauma, devastating trail of loss, sufferings experienced by the people on the edge under the NRC, or who are the other lives who are carrying with them the burden of a fractured past, living under the glooming shadow of exclusion, and thus helping us introspect the multiple dimensions of the crisis of citizenship induced by the Indian state upon its citizens, entangled into varied social cultural frameworks without acknowledging the depth of their trauma and how they're coping with the scars of erasure. Now, basically, no one in Assam could ever realize that a piece of yellow piece of identity paper could hold our lives live in a limbo until the onset of the NRC some years ago. Now, the immense power inherent in these identity papers of yesteryear is so pervasive that it seems to determine life and death beyond the ambit of everyday precarity. Now, just to share an interview data, take the case of Saibun Nesa Laskar. She is a poor domestic helper who hails from a small village in southern Assam. So she basically took her life during the NRC's initial application phase, fearing deportation as she failed to acquire adequate legacy data and necessary family history data to get enrolled in the ongoing NRC. Her neighbor confided that she had been extremely worried about her legacy data for the past few months. She could find her husband's name in the list, but not her name, which led her to panic. So now with the NRC, we are looking at invariably at a major crisis. It is a crisis of humanity, of our institutions and culture, which also changes the terms of being Indian. And this crisis can be seen through the lens of loneliness. Now, Hannah Arendt reminds us that loneliness encompasses the whole of human life. And she rightly says that it is one of the most radical and desperate experiences of man, where everything becomes hopeless and bleak. Now, the accumulated impact of the NRC on the psyche of the vulnerable has been extremely, extremely severe. The anxiety manufactured through the NRC process invariably takes one to a world of loneliness. The suicide of Hanif Khan from a district of Assam only reiterates this. Now, Hanif Khan was one of the many people who had committed suicide in Assam, unable to bear the social pain of the NRC process. So people who are basically declared illegal suffer from political, civil, and social death. And these deaths have also impacted the lives of the families. Hanif Khan committed suicide in 2018 because he was scared that he would be sent to jail for 5 years and would have to pay a hefty fine. And his wife, who I had interviewed, mentioned that he was extremely scared, and her husband was informed by NRC officials that he had used the wrong legacy data, because of which he would be penalized. Now, procurements made from various government quarters about deporting those who are unable to prove their citizenship to Bangladesh or denying them fundamental rights have resulted in the lives like those of Hanif Khan simply not considered valuable and therefore become ungrievable. Now, reflecting that a life without citizenship would not be worth living, many people have ended their lives. And in the same token, their death has not been mourned by the state because they have never lived in the eyes of the Indian state. His life, like many others in Assam, remains invalidated by a slip of yellow paper. Indeed, it is very disconcerting to see how lives otherwise rendered ineligible by the oppression of the post-colonial state have suddenly come under its microscope. However, Hanif Khan was not the first or the last of the suicides related to the citizenship determination process, as more than 100 people have committed suicide at several stages of this exercise, some under pressure owing to the formalities associated with the process, some after not finding their names in the list, and some because of the trauma and humiliation of unbelonging, making people lose their will to live. Now, I'll just share another case study. Kamal Akhtar's wife, Saima Khatun, she mentioned that her husband had left a note under his pillow. He asked his family members to attend his hearing. He arranged his documents in a folder before he stepped out for the last time from his room, only to hang himself from a tree near the river. Now, even when he was sure that he would end his life, he wanted to be remembered as a citizen and not as someone illegal. For the state, these deaths have been nothing but collateral damages of the citizenship determination exercise. Now, contrary to the principles of natural justice, the categorization of citizenship that is going on in India basically considers every resident of Assam guilty until proven innocent. Now, all those who have lost their lives in the process were Bengali-speaking Muslims and Hindus, and it is this targeting of the Bengali citizens that speaks volume about the presence of racism, which is imbibed in the process as it was leveled at different stages and articulated in different forms at different moments. It also revealed that the social production of race through everyday practices such as reading marks of non-belonging of the body. Now, people's everyday experiences of persecution, oppression in the hands of the state basically struck at what it means to be a human and who is allowed to live or die and in the hands of the state. And one is reminded of Aaron's reflections of stateless people as those who live outside the pale of the law and those over whom police are given absolute authority. Bronwyn, if you could just kindly change the slide. Now, with regards to the problems faced by people,
just 1 or 2 more minutes, please.
Yeah. Now, in course of an interview with a person, he shared that his wife and his youngest son went missing for a few months. After a few months after the publication of the NRC list. He basically complained that his wife was suffering from immense stress after the list publications, since she did not have any supporting documents to establish her linkage with her parents. Besides, she also faced social exclusion as people used to taunt her by calling her a Bangladeshi infiltrator whenever they would see her out, and sometimes also used to scare her by saying that the police would come and take her away. The trauma was so severe that the 7-year-old son would often wake up in the middle of his sleep, shivering and crying, asking whether they would be put in a jail. Now, the interviewee claimed that unable to cope up with the stress, his wife went missing along with his son. Now, the NRC has not only contributed to the creation and perpetuation of mental disorders, but it has also resulted in torn families, which perhaps can never be mended. Bronwyn, if you could just kindly change the slide. I'll just give you all some moments to read the story of this person who at an age of 102 years, he was sent to the detention camp. Bronwyn, if you could just kindly change the slide. So as you read it, I'll just kind of mention that for the NRC, in order to prove one's citizenship, they had to go to a foreigners tribunal to defend their citizenship, for which every person had to spend on an average $140 to $70 US. And I mean, from selling off their livestock to houses to mortgaging their land, I mean, people basically fought tooth and nail to prove their citizenship. And daily wage laborers basically had to take loans and they had to work for free for the moneylenders till they could repay the debts. And yet their citizenship basically remained uncertain as to whether they would be able to prove their citizenship. Now, I don't know whether you've been able to, yeah. So I'll just come to the conclusion. So my research, and this is also part of my conclusion, responses and reactions of the government. So my research basically concludes that besides the deployment of labels such as insiders and outsiders, the migrant insecurity in Assam and India continues to be increasingly institutionalized through state-sanctioned violence, which has laid the framework for future humanitarian disasters through the perpetuation of a discourse on self and the other. The discussion also shows how inclusive nationalism rather than homogeneous nationalism should be the focal point of policymakers, as otherwise the very idea of citizenship becomes fragile with the intensity of religion, ethno-linguistic identities, and a sudden criminalization of a certain section of population who had been living in the states in ages. Now, the NRC has basically entrenched and weaponized the binaries of insiders and outsiders. The statements of Indian leaders, as you have already seen in the slide, are replete with terms like Ghuspetia, which means infiltrators and termites, and claims of large number of unfair inclusions from particular communities. The BJP President Amit Shah was quick to assert the language of infiltrators and illegal immigrants into the unfolding of the political slugfest, and also he went on to say that those left out will suffer the worst form of exclusion and humiliation. Just one second, I'll just go on to the conclusion. Now, considering that human migration has been a historical fact of human civilization, and as such, its prevalence has been increasing manifold in our times for various reasons, the idea of citizenship and corresponding rights need to be human-centric rather than state-centric. So thank you for giving me a patient hearing, and I apologize for taking an extra time. Sincere apologies.
Thank you very much, and I'm sorry to cut into you there because it was a really interesting presentation, and the stories are so tragic that it seems dreadful to interrupt, but we've 4 panelists to include in this session. Yeah, I'll hand over to you.
I was in the program indeed for a presentation on Ghana, and I thought I could get away with that. And Eve was okay with it, but I thought I should do something else that's more appropriate for the region.
You can see that now.
I've lived and worked in the region for 5 years, so I feel a bond. To some extent, I belong there. I was in Suriname for 5 years, working my first job. My presentation is where the region actually is in terms of the coverage of the population by either civil registration, birth registration, or by a national ID. The first point to make is that it is unique in history that any of the development agendas or periods include legal identity, although it has been since the Declaration of Human Rights since 1946, of course, been important, but only in 2013 the High Panel decided that it should be part of it. And the United Nations has formed a so-called Legal Identity Task Force, which is an interesting club of virtually all United Nations organizations, including those who have never been interested in the topic. The Deputy Secretary General leads that task force, or the activities, under the name of United Nations Legal Identity Agenda. And UNICEF and UNDP co-chair that agenda. The United Nations Statistics Division is responsible for the measurement. And in 2014, there has been a really intense discussion how legal identity would be measured without there being a satisfactory outcome of those discussions. Discussions in which statisticians play a role, but the statisticians who were in New York were not, as far as I could see, knowledgeable about civil registration specifically. They were generalists. So we have inherited quite a problematic situation to measure progress. One of the things that is definitely not in order, that the data on legal identity, whether it's birth registration or national ID data, are 4 to 7 years old. So when we ultimately get to 2030, the data then available will just be too old to say whether we have achieved a legal identity for all or not. The quality of the data leaves much to be desired. There are issues with the data, serious issues. And an example of that is a publication that UNICEF recently issued called Are We on Track? Their first publication on, as the term says, whether there was any progress towards the SDG 69, birth registration for all. The problem with that publication was that what they called the situation now actually was the situation 4 or 5 years ago. So by the beginning of the period 2015-2016, good for a baseline, but not good to measure progress. But the region I have concentrated a lot on Africa, generally a bit on Asia. Latin America is kind of new for me, so it was interesting to just dive into the data available. So very quickly, it's 49 countries, 33 of which are independent. It's about 650 million people. The civil registration is very old in the region. In Peru, in the time of the Inca Empire, there was a form of civil registration. The region was not the first. You have Egypt, Rome, China, Japan, but after that, it is Peru, which is very early. The region is also unique in the sense, unique in the sense that it was colonized early when you compare it to Africa, and that it also became independent early. And that led, for example, to the continuation of civil registration, which was introduced there by the independent countries. And all countries in the region do have a civil registration system without fail. The data problem is concentrated in 3 organizations. First, you have the United Nations Statistics Division, which is supposed to collect data on civil registration, on birth and death registration rates, but the quality of their data is again not very precise. I see that we have the screen up. The data from UNSD give a range for most of the countries. And that's okay for statisticians, perhaps, but it's not okay when you want to measure legal identity, because the difference between 89 and 96 is 7%. 7% of people is a whole lot of people. When you consider that the 1 billion that the World Bank is estimating is 1 out of 7. It's about between 10 and 15% that they estimate. Then 7% lower or higher is half of the number of people without identity, if the World Bank is right. So that is very inaccurate. Then I did a test for the region, and I took 7 countries that represent about 15% of the population in the country, in the region: Argentina, Bolivia, Colombia, Dominican Republic, Ecuador, Haiti, and Nicaragua together. And I looked at what the World Bank estimated the number of unidentified people would be in those 7 countries, and I found that the actual number, using the same data as were available to the World Bank when they did this, is actually only 15% of the number that the World Bank publishes. So this is just too much of an inaccuracy in the data. If you apply that to the total that the World Bank estimates for the region, 34 million people unidentified, if you take 15% of that, it would only be 5 million. Yes. So it's just not good enough. If these organizations take themselves seriously, then they have to collect data, more timely data, and they should have started with this, of course, years ago, if not 75 years ago. But the UNSD has been sitting on its behind, waiting for things to arrive there out of the countries. It's unforgivable. And I'm really very upset with the United Nations, how poor they do in the quality of data and the timeliness of data. So the World Bank, all data, but, and that's the good news, if you really seriously look at what is available, the surveys that are being done in the countries, what civil registration authorities report to UNSD, to UNICEF, then what we find is that in the region, almost 96% was registered for birth. And that is for the group, for the children 0 to 4 years old. And I come back to that. So it's not the 94% that UNICEF has in its publication of Are We on Track, which was in 2020, 94% in 2020. No, in 2015, it was already 96%. And UNSD with that range, it's absolutely of no use to get data like that. The ID systems, there has been a survey, the Global Findex survey done by the World Bank or paid for. And that gives for the region almost 95% coverage. That's only for 30 countries, but those 30 countries account for 97, 98%, not the 91 there, but 97 to 98% of the population. For the UNSD, which is responsible for civil registration and vital statistics, but which has never taken the civil registration part seriously, which is important for legal identity, but has always been preoccupied with statistics. UNSD would say, oh, when it's over 90%, it's complete. Well, of course, it's not complete. Yeah, there is still some way to go. And leaving no one behind is not, well, when it's 90%, it's okay. No one left behind means 100%. Now, the good news for the region is also that we are now in 2021. Yes, we have COVID. COVID will have had an impact on registration. But I think that impact will not be catastrophic. We know that until 2019, the coverage rates will have improved. And very interestingly, and I must say the Inter-American Development Bank, Mia Harbits, they have done a great job in doing really useful, pragmatic studies oriented towards organization of civil registration. How do we do a good job in that? And one of their studies was with regards to the link between civil registration and education. They looked at 5 countries and found that if you take the 0 to 4 years old or 0 to 6 years old, those shares of unregistered children are much higher than for youth older than that. So the coverage rate for older children and even for older adults becomes better and better. So in the Dominican Republic, for example, you will find that the coverage even of adults is almost 100%. And I know there's lots of problems with regards to the marginalized people who might not figure very well in these data. Yeah, that is a separate problem, but I feel that also there, I don't see why the UNSD has not felt responsible for finding information, collecting data on statelessness, on people without identity. It definitely has been part of the mandate. Yeah. I have a sheet there with regards to a comparison between birth registration and IDs, and the results are that actually in the Dominican Republic, birth registration is more equitable, is more inclusive than ID. And ID also tends to become more pro-rich over time, something I found in Pakistan, but I also found in the Dominican Republic. So rich people definitely over time get better covered by ID, and poor people get less covered. Then the next one gives you an overall picture of how the region is. You can skip that one. I won't talk about that now. But a comparison with other regions over 2000, 2015. And when you look at the green one, which is the region, the region basically has improved a lot in relative terms, in absolute terms, and is very close to reaching the final desired situation of coverage of all people in the region. I know that the whole conference has been about the problems. But
I'm going to cut you off. That's it.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, your final conclusion is legal identity is feasible, but you can talk about that more in Q&A.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you very much. I told you I was going to be brutal. I ended up being brutal, but thank you very much.
So thank you, everyone. I don't even know where to start right now. I am so moved and so incredibly humbled that a vision that I had a number of years ago has kind of come to fruition, because as I stated at the beginning of the conference, I've long been involved in these questions, but always saw that there was the Americas was always kind of mentioned, but also somehow sidelined. And I think that this conference has done so well in bringing all of these questions that we've been visiting in the field for such a long time, and sharing these experiences globally, and the synergies that are there, and the linkages, I think, for future collaboration and future discussions are just so clear to me today. I had a number of questions as well from people asking about the panel sessions. Just to tell you that all of the panels have been recorded and they will be uploaded as well, and you will be able to share them at some point. So please don't lose contact. Please stay in touch with me after this event, and I'll more than happily share those links with you as and when they are ready. Also, as well as thanking everybody for such a rich and inspiring conference, there are some colleagues I would like to recognise. So I have my colleague Manuela Carpenedo, I think is still on the call. I don't know if she wants to switch on her camera and give us a wave, because she has been in the background. Maybe if we could give her a round of applause. She's been in the background helping me with this fantastic effort and conference, alongside the director of CLACS, who is Linda Newson, and also our colleague Ainoa Montoya, and last but not least Jenny Stubbs, who is the administrator, who will see this in the recordings, but was too shy to come on the call today to be formally thanked. So thank you so much to all of you for supporting me in this. Thank you also to our keynote speaker, Professor Wendy Hunter, who I think did a very, very important job of underlining the necessity to remember and keep remembering his history and the historical linkages in answering and understanding these questions. Thank you also to Jaap for your for talking about legal identity right at the end, and showing how legal identity is a cross-cutting theme, but also and so central. It's going to be such an important theme over the coming decade, and is something that is so I can see you waving there, so important and central to what we're talking about. And then just to recap then, so over the past 2 days, we've talked about so many broad themes, from nation building, national identities and belonging in the Americas. We've looked at the historical and colonial relevance of registration practices. We've talked about the importance of slavery, of forced migration, the process of blanqueamiento, so whitening practices across the continent, and how linked these are to then contemporary ID practices, and particularly their impact on modern day constructs of belonging. We've also looked at citizenship rights for Indigenous, Afro-descended and religious identities. And very importantly as well, a discussion that I don't think we have enough were the contributions that we had from our friends in Peru, who were looking at the challenges to legal definitions of status, including non-binary identities. We've also managed to thread together so many global themes as well. So we've talked about diasporic citizenship and contested identities in and across the Anglophone and the Francophone Caribbean. So we've talked about the Windrush scandal, which is an extremely important and relevant topic for us here in the UK. We've also looked at the Bumidom registrations, and then we've linked that then to the Assam tonight, to the Assam in India, to the Kenyan case, and to all these other examples that we also couldn't mention, perhaps, which are the Rohingya as well. I think are very important to remember that these stories are built on lived experiences, and that people are experiencing them in all sorts of different ways, but also many discriminatory ways as well. And today then we've also tried to build on this history and this understanding of these practices to think towards the future, to ask ourselves what challenges lie ahead with regards to social protection, gender inclusion, birth registration, the digital divide and access to citizenship rights. what role are biometrics playing in how we are documenting and recording people? And again, how are populations experiencing legal and digital identification measures? I thought it was fantastic that someone brought up today the right to be forgotten as well. I think it's so important to remember that we do have a right to be forgotten and not to be entirely identifiable or traceable or trackable or marked. And the role of death registrations, again, is something, the theme that I think we forget so much about. It's not just the people who are being born into this system, but people who are leaving it as well. What is happening with their data and with how their information is being recorded. And in the second to last panel, we saw the case of the Dominican Republic, which was my motivation really for organising this event today, and to examine questions of statelessness, the making of foreigners, that Jade talked so well about and started us off about at the beginning of the conference. So this idea about who is foreign and who is a national, how are we thinking about these different aspects and constructs of citizenship, how are these being reimagined, reconstructed and played out. So perhaps most importantly of all then is the question as to whether we've entered a new era with regards to digital identity rights, and particularly in the face of the COVID pandemic. And as we look towards the future, is this a new era with old problems, as somebody said today? Or as Amal, the co-host of our project with the of our conference with the Institute on Statelessness and Inclusion, asked, has the horse already bolted? Are we too late? So these were just some of the main themes that kind of resonated with me over such a rich and just such a multidisciplinary and wonderfully global and international conference today. And I'm just kind of leaving it with an open question then. So the next steps, what's next? Where do we go from here? Where do we continue these conversations to ensure that we're speaking to each other about these issues? And yeah, that's basically it from me. I'd just like to say thank you. I don't have time to read through all the comments right away, but I certainly will be saving them. And just to say, yeah, please do reach out to me. Please email me after this conference and tell me, where do we go next with this? Any suggestions or ideas you have about what we can do with this wealth of research and the importance of the questions that we ask. So thank you, everybody. And I look forward to seeing you, I hope in person rather than virtually seeing you. I hope that we can begin to live in a world again where we can actually give each other a hug and say hi to each other. Así que mil gracias a todos y todas por su participación hoy. Muito obrigada. Me estoy emocionando, así que por eso me salí en español. Thank you, everybody. I really appreciate it, and goodbye.